Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York City. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Alexis Christoforous. It is Sunday, August 23rd. Welcome to our listeners and viewers across all Bloomberg platforms, radio, TV, streaming, Bloomberg.com, and of course, the Bloomberg Business app. And this morning, we are still kind of digesting that news from yesterday as the story continues to evolve, the evolving trade war between Canada and the U.S.
Yeah, piecing together what happened at that meeting on Friday night, getting perspectives from both sides, from the Canadian and the U.S. sides, of what the sticking points were in those negotiations, and the president weighing in on Truth Social overnight. I should say there was a torrent of posts from the president. This one says, Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one. They've also charged our great farmers for many years massive amounts of tariffs. No more, 3 exclamation marks. And Christine, I think this gets to something that's been a roiling issue throughout the last couple of years here. The president talking about Canada becoming the 51st state, impeding on Canada's sovereignty. And indeed, as you look at kind of the readouts that we've gotten of what happened on Friday night, Prime Minister Mark Carney saying to the Americans, summarizing this in his comments to the press afterward, these kinds of remarks were unacceptable.
It has not gone down well the first time. It certainly is not going down well now. And it's leading to other theories about why these talks broke down. So we're going to break that down with some of our guests later. But first, we're going to go to Alexis for the headlines.
All right, thanks a lot, guys, and good morning. Canada is answering back after the U.S. imposed 50% tariffs on $20 billion worth of Canadian products yesterday, including plywood, liquor, electrical equipment, and hockey gear. Prime Minister Mark Carney says Canada will apply counter tariffs on $20 billion of U.S. products September 8th, escalating the feud, rocking one of the world's biggest trading relationships. Carney said he was left with little choice after trade talks with President Trump's administration broke down Friday night. The Canadian levies will apply to U.S. steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, electronics, and more. The new leader of Iran's top security body is threatening its neighbors against joining new U.S. efforts to squeeze Tehran's economy. Egypt is trying to revive Iran-U.S. negotiations. Meantime, Iraq says Tehran has helped some ships carrying Iraqi oil to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Meantime, France and Saudi Arabia are expected to discuss plans later today to bypass the critical waterway. Residents on Hawaii's Big Island are bracing for heavy rains and gusty winds as Tropical Storm Moke makes its way through the island. Forecasters warn the rainfall could cause life-threatening flooding and mudslides. Residents are still dealing with the aftermath of heavy flooding and damaging winds from last week's Lala. And it is day 12 without power for tens of thousands of residents in Gary, Indiana, nearly 2 weeks after thunderstorms swept through the state, killing at least 7 people. Hurricane-force winds toppled trees and power lines, and heavy rains flooded neighborhoods. Indiana's Governor Mike Braun is calling on the local power utility to, quote, match the urgency of residents who have had to endure the power outage. NIPSCO Power says it is working around the clock to restore power. And President Donald Trump made more than 1,000 securities trades in June, including buying shares of Berkshire Hathaway, Visa, MasterCard, and Coinbase. That's according to a financial disclosure published this weekend. In all of 2025, Trump made more than 21,000 securities trades, often in bursts tied to market events he created. The White House says there were no conflicts of interest because Trump's investments are entirely made by independent managers. Christina and Dave.
21,000. Substantial amount of trades, yes.
Yeah. And some good initial reporting on those trades from our colleagues here at Bloomberg.
Yes, and oftentimes trades in the same day, buying and selling in the same day.
Right.
All right. Alexis, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, Canada's President Mark Carney is punching back, promising retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. that will take effect on Tuesday, September 8th. Bloomberg is reporting trade talks between the U.S. and Canada collapsed in part because of requests Canada made to cut U.S. tariffs on medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Carney says the U.S. also wanted to put limits on Canada's trade deals with other countries.
Chrystia Freeland is the former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, now the CEO of the Rhodes Trust and a contributor to Bloomberg News. She joins us today from Keefe in Ukraine. And Chrystia, we want to talk about the Independence Day commemorations here in just a few minutes, but let's talk about the U.S.-Canada relationship First, you were the lead negotiator in 2018 on USMCA, CUSMA in Canadian parlance. And given all of that experience, I just wanted to ask you first if you were surprised by what happened here, drawing again from the Prime Minister's remarks yesterday. He said proposed last-minute changes were, in his words, unfair and uneconomic, and they called into question the reliability of any deal.
I'm very proud of the position that Canada and Prime Minister Carney have taken. I'm not surprised. I am relieved. I think that we were on the brink of a deal that would have been a bad deal for Canada, and also, frankly, a bad deal for the United States. And I'm glad that that didn't happen. My experience in the ultimately successful negotiation of the USMCA is that the way to get a good deal with the Trump administration is you need to do three things. First, do look for areas where you can cooperate, and there are a lot. Ultimately, this is a win-win relationship. Second, I think it's so important for Canada to make the case beyond the White House. In 2018, we called it the donut strategy. And I think Americans are basically good, decent, smart people. And I think Americans broadly recognize their relationship with Canada is excellent and they don't want to break it. And I think Team Canada now really needs to go out and explain that to Americans. And then the third thing, which can be hard and which we saw just now, is with this administration, you cannot capitulate. My motto was, we do not escalate and we do not back down. And I think that is the only language that the Trump administration understands, unfortunately.
You heard some statements from some provincial governors yesterday saying, please don't take our politeness for weakness. I know that you were not involved in these particular trade talks, but I'm sure you're talking to people and you know this process so intimately. I'm wondering what your take is on kind of how this broke down. Politico is reporting this morning, something we've already mentioned. U.S. officials blamed Canada, saying they wanted these lower tariffs on heavy trucks. And some Canadian leaders have pointed the finger at kind of infighting within the Trump administration, excuse me, it's early, within the Trump administration between Lutnick, Greer. It wasn't clear who was in charge at all times. What's your take on all this?
Okay, so first of all, Christina, and I want to say this in a nice Canadian way and not be a jerk. Canada has a prime minister, not a president, so it's Prime Minister Carney. And we have premiers and not governors, so it's the Canadian premiers you've been hearing about. I need to say that because otherwise your Canadian listeners will get mad at me.
Of course, I do know that. Again, I apologize. I even wrote it down correctly. I think my brain is not quite firing on all cylinders today.
No, I totally know you do, and I'm sorry to sound jerkish, but Canadians will pay attention to that, especially now. Canadians are very sensitive. Look, I'm not privy to the inside details of the negotiation, and even if I were, it's not my place to reveal them. But what I will say is this. I think that there is a fundamental challenge here that we have to break out of to have a successful deal. I think that the Canadian perspective is a trading relationship with the United States can be a win-win relationship. And that has been the experience for Canada and the United States during NAFTA and since the CUSMA, since the USMCA was concluded. We don't see this as a zero-sum game. We don't see this as about dominance and submission. We think we can reach a deal that works for both parties. I think at heart, that is not President Trump's view. And that is a real problem. And it's a problem not only for Canada, it's a problem for the United States. And I'm going to give you one specific example. The tariffs on Canadian aluminum, which the administration has been insisting on keeping in place, are bad for Canada. We should not agree to them. We have a trade deal. We should not agree to a side deal that sets worse conditions than our free trade deal. But the point I want to make for your listeners is it is really dumb for the United States to impose tariffs on Canadian aluminum. You need our aluminum for your defense sector. You need our aluminum for manufacturing. Those tariffs are a tax, and aluminum is the best example of the wrongheadedness of the administration's approach right now, because aluminum is basically electricity in solid form. And as you know, Americans need more electricity right now with the AI boom. So why would you put a tax on electricity?
Chrystia, I want to ask you about the potential consequences here of this escalating or spiraling trade war. So you have the tariffs put in place, the retaliatory tariffs we expect the Prime Minister to put in place on September the 8th. This could escalate and escalate. And I noted in a piece that Bloomberg had yesterday, there was a professor at the University of Calgary noting that if the tariffs remain in place, Canada could lose almost 90,000 jobs. The Prime Minister, in his comments yesterday, in the statement following the dissolution of this meeting, said he wasn't being cavalier about this decision. But I wonder if you could talk about the very real consequences for Canadians of this escalating or spiraling, in fact.
So Canadians, I think, understand the situation very, very well. I think Canadians recognize that we are a smaller economy. But Canadians also recognize that there are fundamental principles at stake, that Canada's sovereignty is at stake. And I think the Prime Minister has the entire country behind him on this one. The other thing is, the lesson of our very recent history, the lesson of 2018 and 2019, when the first time the US imposed tariffs, illegal and unjustified tariffs that went outside our NAFTA deal, is retaliation works. So in 2018, the US imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. At the time, I was Canada's foreign minister responsible for the trading relationship. And we responded with dollar for dollar retaliation. The president threatened to destroy Canada as a result, but we went through with it. And in less than a year, the US lifted its tariffs on our steel and aluminum. And the reason for that was the US tariffs didn't make sense. And Canadian retaliation actually hurt. I think that that's what we're going to see happen this time, too.
I'm wondering, I was listening to BBC this morning, and they were floating this idea that the theory behind this, someone was saying they think the theory behind this folds back to that 51st state issue, that the president is actively trying to tank the Canadian economy so that Canada is more willing to do exactly what you just said Canada shouldn't do, capitulate, come to the table, and then get into the American fold. That seems a little far-fetched to me, but I do think it's interesting that that is a narrative that is being spoken about in not ridiculous circles. I wanted to get your take on that. And just what is the strategy here, if there is one, to antagonizing our neighbor and one of our largest trading partners?
Look, it is definitely not my job to speak for the Trump administration. But the president has been very clear and consistent since before he was sworn in the second time. He has repeatedly said he wants Canada to be the 51st state. He has repeatedly referred to the Canadian Prime Minister as a governor. He's the president of the United States. I think Canada and the world does have to take those assertions really seriously. And that's why I'm so proud of Canada for standing strong. What I would say to Americans who are listening to us is I think you need to think very seriously as a country about whether you want to have allies. It feels to me like what we're hearing from the White House is the president wants only to have vassals. He doesn't want to have partners. I know as a Canadian, Canada will never accept being a vassal. Prime Minister Stephen Harper, a former prime minister from a different party, a conservative, said shortly after President Trump was elected that Canada should be prepared to accept any amount of economic harm to retain our sovereignty. I think that's a widely held view in Canada. But what I would say to Americans is, why wouldn't you want to have partners in the world? Why is your government treating your adversaries, I would name a country like China or a country like Russia, more respectfully than you are treating countries like Canada, like EU, NATO partners, like Denmark, countries that have been your allies for a very long time? I don't think that that is in the long-term interests of America and Americans.
On the subject of allyship, as I mentioned, you're in Kyiv. Independence Day commemorations are tomorrow. It's the 4.5-year anniversary of the conflict, this full-scale invasion as well. I want to get your read on what's been targeted lately and what that says about the state of this conflict. So we've seen Ukraine going after energy facilities in Russia, for instance, going after e-commerce facilities as well. Conversely, we've seen Russia attacking shopping malls in Ukraine in recent days here. Where do you see the conflict in its current terms as you look at kind of the broader sweep of it? And what do you make of this escalation when it comes to kind of targeting important economic, important parts of the economies of both of these countries?
Great question. And I do want to start by saying, I think we have to be really, really careful always not to create some kind of a false equivalence between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine was illegally invaded twice by Russia. Ukraine, if Russia withdrew from Ukrainian territory, Ukraine would stop the war immediately. And Russia invaded Ukraine having recognized Ukraine's borders and having actually guaranteed those borders in the 90s when Ukraine gave up its nuclear missiles. So we have to be really, really clear who is the aggressor, who is committing war crimes. Having said that, the Ukrainians have, I think, surprised a lot of people, maybe everyone other than the Ukrainians themselves, by the effectiveness of their military campaign this year. And they've done three things that are really working. One, as you say, David, is the deep strikes inside Russia. And those strikes have been particularly targeting Russia's oil refining capacity. That's important because what it means is ordinary Russians are feeling the pain of war, and it also limits Russia's war machine. Second thing that Ukrainians have done really effectively is they're turning out to be really, really good at the drone war. And, you are seeing that they're holding the line on the front. Mm-hmm. The third thing that Ukrainians are doing is they've turned the Russian control of Crimea from a Russian advantage and Crimea from a foothold into Ukraine into a real weakness. So the Ukrainians are doing well, but they're really suffering for it. And there's a lot of concern here that it's going to be a hard winter.
Chrystia, Freeland, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for joining us from Kyiv as well. Really appreciate your perspective on this Sunday morning. Hope to speak with you again soon when you're back in Canada. Coming up, diving deeper into the Trump administration's economic strategy as Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent teases more intervention in the days ahead and focuses on an economic D-Day for the country of Iran. That's coming up next on Bloomberg This Weekend on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Alexis Christoforous. Let's update you now on today's top stories. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney says he had little choice but to impose retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. after the Trump administration slapped a 50% surcharge yesterday on $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, everything from wine to hockey sticks. Carney says Canada will retaliate dollar for dollar beginning September 8th, targeting sectors including steel, dairy, appliances, and agricultural equipment. Trade talks between the longtime allies broke down Friday night, and both the U.S. and Canada now face the risk of a full-scale trade war. Now to a Bloomberg exclusive. Some of NVIDIA's biggest customers have been told that the prices of servers containing its artificial intelligence chips are going up by more than 15% in many cases because of the soaring cost of memory chips. The price hikes will go into effect on systems shipped early next year and will impact systems including those with the flagship Vera Rubin and Grace Blackwell chips. Major tech companies, including Apple and Qualcomm, have recently said they've been forced to charge more for their products because of chip shortages. And now it's the moon's turn to pull a disappearing act. North and South America will get a front row seat to a near total lunar eclipse coming this Thursday night into Friday. That's when the Earth's shadow will briefly envelop 96% of the moon, making this an especially deep partial eclipse. Scientists say it is the second act of the greatest show of the solar system. 2 weeks ago, the moon moved directly between Earth and the sun, creating a solar eclipse through Greenland, Iceland, and Spain. I remember we were able to see it here in the U.S. a couple of years ago.
I remember
Got the special glasses to watch it.
People drove up to
So
Maine
cool.
and
Yeah.
New
I was in the
Hampshire.
UK for this one. We were supposed to be able to see it.
Did you? It was cloudy.
We may have gotten
UK.
distracted with some bottles of wine in the pub
Understood.
There
and
you
not
go.
wandered
Well,
that
outside. I'm
explains it.
sure it was glorious, but the pub was too. All right, thanks, Alexis. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is set to hold a press conference tomorrow where he'll lay out the details of planned sanctions against Iran. Sanctions the president has likened to an economic D-Day.
Well, here's what the president said about that on Friday.
The shifting economic warfare towards Iran, does that indicate that the military options in the region for the U.S. are limited?
No, not at all. It just means that we're seeing what happens. They have no money. They have no Navy. They have no Air Force. They are not paying their soldiers. They're not paying their police. They have 350% inflation. So we're just going to sort of see what happens. And we have total control, as you know, of the border. We have total control. If you look at the blockade, we have total control of that entire region having to do with the Strait of Hormuz.
Joining us now from our Washington bureau is Wendy Benjaminson, a senior editor here at Bloomberg News. Wendy, great to speak with you. And I just want to pick on something we've talked about over the course of the weekend here. This is a country, Iran, that has been heavily sanctioned, is heavily sanctioned, and has been for such a long period of time here. Yes, there's the tease of more announcements to come, but as you think this through, what more is there that the U.S. could do at this point in time to kind of tighten the economic vice on Iran?
You know, David, that's an excellent question. And there are things that they can do, and we'll hear from Bessent tomorrow about what those are. But each one of them pulls another thread that could undo it or make it worse for the United States. I mean, as you said, Iran has been under crushing sanctions for more than 40 years, since the revolution. And they have, and Trump was right, sort of, in describing their economic conditions, but big surprise, overstated it a bit. It is not 350% inflation, but it is around 80% inflation. There are 2,200 sanctions on them. I mean, they're isolated on the world. I mean, it's not a great situation for them. So what else can Trump do? He can go after their major trading partners. The only trouble with that is their major trading partner is China, who is has no problem retaliating on the United States in terms of tariffs or other economic pressure, export controls, because the U.S. buys so much from China. And China buys 90% of Iran's oil. So that's who you really have to go after if you want to change this. But neither China nor Iran are really listening to the United States or necessarily afraid of them. I mean, Iran just isn't showing any signs of capitulating at this point.
I also wonder about the enforcement, even if there really was the effort from the White House to go after China or third parties for buying Iranian oil. When it comes to China, to your point, that is not someone Trump has wanted to take on head on. And I just wonder, first of all, if there is a mechanism to sufficiently enforce that, if the U.S. has the capacity for it, and if there is the will for that from the White House, especially given Xi's upcoming visit.
Well, you hit on it, Christina. I mean, Trump wants the visit with Xi Jinping this fall to go very well. He likes to show off his relationships with leaders around the world, especially those that aren't, the most popular kids at the cafeteria. And so,
story of my life, Wendy. Story of my life.
Me too. So he wants it to go well. I don't really know how he's going to balance that. The other point is that Bessent, calls this the greatest coordinated economic, program in the history of the world. And Trump said in that Truth Social post, come on, allies, let's go. Let's all do this together. But this is the same sort of sudden demands. I heard the Canadian official, Chrystia Freeland, say a few minutes ago that Trump doesn't want allies, he wants vassals. And that was an excellent point because, when the U.S. and Israel started bombing Iran back in February, it was like they were asking all the allies in Europe, come on, join us. But they didn't know what was going to happen. They had gotten, a small heads up request to use their bases. And their response, I think reasonably, was, wait a minute, what are you getting us into? And I think that's the same thing here. We haven't heard about much coordination discussion going on with allies who might be able to pile on to this Iranian thing. The Bushes, for whatever you think about the Bush's presidencies, they were very good at building international coalitions to get things done. And Trump hasn't really shown that skill.
I want to go back to that clip we played of the president talking about military options still being on the table. There's been kind of an interesting debate over the course of the last week centering on how much the administration, particularly Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, has talked about economic warfare versus military warfare. And I think that there's a school of thought that by doing that, you're kind of giving carte blanche to Iran to do more. That if that seems to be the U.S.'s focus right now, they're not investing in kind of more strikes, more military action. Maybe that opens the door for Iran going back down that route. And I wonder how you see that dynamic playing out here, Wendy.
Well, that's certainly a risk, David. I mean, in Iran's sort of unusual power structure, their elite military, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, those guys are getting paid. Those guys are pretty much running the war. And we can see that what this might do is then their attitude is, well, fine, then the pressure that we'll put on, since they're unable to put economic pressure on the U.S. or its Gulf allies, is to continue to bomb them. The Navy is not, I don't know, between their Navy or their Air Force, but their military is clearly not destroyed. They clearly still have munitions. They clearly still have thousands of cheap drones that they can send across the Gulf. And so, yeah, the IRGC can just keep doing what it wants. This also doesn't put pressure on Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz for free traffic as it always was. Now they might be incentivized to really insist on that toll that they've been talking to Oman about, and that, of course, would be anathema to the United States.
Wendy, I want to play some sound from the president from a rally Friday night for the late Senator Lindsey Graham's sister, Senator Darlene Graham, but it is on what we were just talking about.
They want to make a deal so badly. We don't even know if we want, because I view the Strait of Hormuz as an American territory right now. It's an American territory.
And the president followed up on True Social with a map of the Strait of Hormuz, labeling it U.S. territory. This cannot be helping diplomatic negotiations. But we were just talking about Canada as the 51st state. We're going to talk later in the show about another country that has had overtures from the White House about becoming part of America. What is this expansionist bent with the White House, and is there strategy behind it? This cannot be helping with negotiations, if there even are any real negotiations happening right now.
No, I think this is just, Trump's sort of signature braggadocio. And if Iran was so desperate for a deal, they would be at a table trying to make a deal, right? And Pakistan and other allies have been, really trying to get the U.S. and Iran back to a table. They've been talking to Witkoff and Kushner and all these envoys. Right now, the foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, says that he has no interest in talking to the United States. So I don't know where that notion comes from. I think this is just Trump trying to, as one of my favorite old governors used to say, Ann Richards of Texas, I think he's trying to put lipstick on a pig. He's trying to make this unpopular war with no end in sight sound better than it is at a political rally for the midterms, when the Republicans who have backed this war with Trump are looking like they're going to lose.
Christina, I said Wendy was joining us from our D.C. bureau, but for our listeners, she's in a much more beautifully decorated space than that. She's joining us from home. Wendy, I'm going to posit that's because you wanted to steer clear of Constitution Avenue because of this Grand Prix that's happening in Washington, D.C. This week. And before we let you go, talk to us a bit about that, how that fits into this, celebration, commemoration of the 250th anniversary, but the way in which President Trump has kind of charted out his own version of that, first involving the UFC and now here, fast cars in the nation's capital.
Right. Trump has this incredibly, I don't know what other word to use for it, macho way of celebrating the nation's 250th birthday. I mean, there are so many ways we could have celebrated that with the progress we've made in our history and things like that. Instead, he used the White House lawn for a UFC fight. He had that Great American State Fair on the Mall, which kind of was a bust. And now I think this one is probably the most popular of the three. We're expecting 140,000 people downtown. And yes, I'll be getting on the metro, not driving to the office later. But there is going to be this Grand Prix where race cars are going to be going like 200 miles an hour on city streets between the White House and the Capitol, and then they'll zoom around Pennsylvania Avenue and come back.
Steer clear is my advice to you.
We're going to have to leave it there. We're going to have to leave it there.
Wendy
I don't know what
Bedredson.
Pennsylvania Avenue is going to look like after this. It could be torn up.
Thank you, Wendy. Appreciate it, as always. And turning to something else entirely, fierce competition from China, high energy costs, just two of the reasons Germany's famous industrial machine has stalled. That's the subject of a new Bloomberg mini documentary.
Europe's biggest economy has a bit of a crisis on its hands.
The economic model is not working anymore.
Germany was the largest exporting nation on the planet.
And now it very much isn't.
Big companies announce restructuring programs, closing factories, closing plants, laying off workers.
Now, historically, Germany's economic story was one of almost uninterrupted growth. But that changed in recent years when a post-pandemic rebound turned into a contraction and the economy began to stagnate.
There is little doubt that the German industry, especially the energy-intensive sector, has been in crisis for years.
And the effects are reaching jobs and industrial communities. Economic anxiety is also pressuring politicians. So what's behind Germany's industrial crisis? And why do some experts think it's running out of time to fix it?
It's a moment in history. When you don't act now, Europe or Germany might be as well a huge open-air museum.
All right, you can see more of that on all our Bloomberg platforms. But first, it's a royal return. We're going to go across the pond to break down Harry and Meghan's homecoming. Will they or won't they make a splash with the British public? That's next on Bloomberg This Weekend. Stick with us.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Alexis Christoforous. Let's update you on today's top stories. President Trump is set to wave the green flag at today's historic Freedom 250 Indy car race in Washington, D.C. President Trump and First Lady Melania will lead a pre-race lap in the presidential limousine before watching the open-wheel race zoom past iconic national monuments along Pennsylvania Avenue at speeds approaching 200 miles per hour. There will also be a pre-race show and a flyover of military aircraft. The Indy car race is the latest of President Trump's celebrations to mark America's 250th birthday. Fan Week at the U.S. Open kicks off today at Arthur Ashe Stadium in New York City. The free week of events leading up to the tournament includes a once-in-a-lifetime exhibition game Tuesday featuring 4 tennis legends. Roger Federer and Andy Roddick will team up to play a doubles match against Andre Agassi and John McEnroe. That's going to be a good one. At this year's tournament, Carlos Alvarez will defend his U.S. Open title. He is favored to win, especially now that Jannik Sinner dropped out of the tournament due to a knee injury. And Chinese humanoid robots broke records set by humans yesterday, including beating Usain Bolt's 100-meter sprint world record, an opening day of the world's humanoid robot games in Beijing. The 5 days of games demonstrate China's progress in advanced robotics and featured more than 2,000 humanoid robots competing in about 50 events, including running, table tennis, and soccer. I'd like to see them go against Timothée Chalamet and Marty Supreme.
Interesting.
See who wins.
That'd be, yeah. Wow. I hadn't thought about that.
I have the same opinion on this story that I did yesterday.
That you're still creeped out by
I do not like this.
The flying robot.
The
for
flying
our radio
robot,
listeners, was an extraordinary thing to behold.
Correct, but also I do feel better about the fact that the running robot did kind of collapse and fall apart after the finish line.
Yes.
So,
well, there's work to be done.
Yes.
I think Usain Bolt, you just feed him some carbs and he goes again. The robot, you got to rebuild.
Break the record
it's
and go to the dustbin.
1 point humans. 1 point humans. Thanks,
Alexis, thank you very much. Well, after more than 6 years in the U.S., Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are headed back to the U.K. According to sources, the family plans to live at a private, non-royal residence outside of London, but fear not. They are going to hang on to their manse in Mendocino, California, and a vacation property in Portugal.
Sentences I would love to be able to say just once in my life. My vacation. Anyway, all right. Joining us now from London is Bloomberg News reporter Tiwa Adebayo. Tiwa, we were told you were the person to talk to about this story. So I guess my initial question is, why is this happening, and how did it seemingly take almost everyone by surprise?
Well, I think the short answer to that really is that we don't know. It does seem incredibly odd, I would say, especially knowing what happened in 2020 when they stepped down from being working royals. It was dramatic. Tabloids in the UK were calling it Megxit. And there was a lot made of this move to the United States. And since then, we've seen their business interests really be centered around that sort of Los Angeles bubble, the Netflix deal they had, the Spotify deal, and then Meghan's own brand As Ever, which is very much tied to her California roots. So I do think the move seems a little bit unexpected. It seems it was also unexpected to King Charles himself, BBC reporting that he was only told about 2 days before their move was announced that they were coming back. But apparently he is looking forward to seeing them more. But it does seem unexpected, definitely a surprise to everyone involved. And it'll be interesting to see what they do from now.
Many questions, including those about Meghan Markle's burgeoning jam and preserves business that she has, along with the Netflix deal.
The breadth of your knowledge does sometimes surprise me, David Gura. I wouldn't have expected you to come up with the jam reference, but please continue.
Tiwa, I'm curious. So we don't know the answer, but let's speculate a little bit here. We know that Prince Harry was back in the country, I think, a few months ago. His father is ailing. Yeah. I think there is so much focus, certainly here in the States, on the quality or lack thereof of the relationship between him and his brother. What about his relationship with his father? And talk a bit about the diagnosis that he's received and how that might be affecting this as well.
Well, yes, that's right. It's been about 2 years now since we heard of the King's diagnosis of cancer. Prince Harry flew straight to the UK on the back of that announcement, and it was said they had a meeting. It seemed like there was perhaps a warming in that relationship. But since then, we've seen perhaps the King and Prince Harry be a little bit distant. The family were back in the UK earlier this summer. They were hosted at Highgrove, which is in Gloucestershire, the King and Queen's residence. And it said that's the first time that King Charles and Queen Camilla have seen their grandchildren in about 4 years. So perhaps maybe not the normal grandparent relationship that you would expect. But we do know, at least from sources that we've heard, that Prince Harry had many regrets about maybe being not with the Queen during her final years. And so some are perhaps speculating that that might be a motivating factor behind this move back to the UK, perhaps to be by the side of the King as he continues to undergo treatment. It is said that he's doing much better, but of course the royals tend to keep health diagnoses private, at least until after the fact. So we don't exactly know the status of the King's health, but it is possible that could be a contributing factor to the decision. We should mention as well, Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet will be enrolling in school in the UK from September. It's perhaps maybe the case that Prince Harry has always wanted the British education that he had for his children. And I think that's a factor to the decision that we have to think about the family life, family living operations. But it's certainly, as I say, we don't know the exact reason, but there could be a number of contributing factors.
School enrollment probably easier for them, shorter timetable than it would be for us here in the States, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. Folks here have applied for their schools before their kids are born. I did want to talk to you about the security issue, though, because this was a big problem. When they stopped being working royals, their security was no longer covered by the state. And so they are here in the U.S. now. Explain this to me. The way this was working is if the family or Prince Harry wanted to come back to the UK, he basically had to apply for permission weeks in advance to then get some sort of security. They'd offered to pay for it. The Met Police said, we're not a rental service. You can't, this was very complicated. He couldn't just pop in and visit his family. Do you think that factors in here?
I mean, certainly. So there's a body in the UK called the Royal and VIP Executive Committee that's overseen by the Home Office, and they're responsible for security arrangements, not just for the royals, but other VIPs that visit the UK. So, for example, Taylor Swift, when she was here on the Eras tour, that's who decided the security arrangements for her. And it was decided, as you mentioned, in 2020, after they stepped down from being working royals, that they would no longer receive the same level of security that they previously did. They'd be downgraded, and they'd receive the same level of security as other royals, for example, Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie, who are no longer full-time working royals. We did see last year Prince Harry challenging that decision in a High Court appeal, which he eventually lost. And at that time, he told the BBC that he couldn't see a world in which he'd bring his family back to the UK if those security arrangements weren't updated. So quite an emphatic statement there, which is why so many are surprised at this seeming change of heart. But what happens at the moment is that the committee had agreed that Prince Harry's travels back to the UK, because he would be an occasional visitor, they'd be decided on a case-by-case basis. So he'd receive security basically ad hoc. Now, that is something that will have to be upgraded if the family are living full-time in the UK, because it won't just be Harry. As we've seen, he hadn't really brought Meghan and the children to the UK with him until earlier this summer. It will be now the whole family living full-time outside of London in the UK, going to school, going about their daily life as a family. So that will be a real point of contention. But as you mentioned, this idea that the Met Police aren't for rental, that is really what's at the core of this. It's a bit of a different setup to the US, where if you want some armed security, you cannot rent it. It has to be given to you. So that's something that's up in the air and something they'll have to work out.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Tua, thank you so much for joining us. And if any of those houses need a house sitter, I'm around.
Could be a recurring segment. We'll have to chart this as it all,
Perfect.
As it all happens. All right, the AI boom, sparking change in the global workforce, also helping to level the playing field for black entrepreneurs. That is the view from David Hall, a managing partner at Revolution. I'll discuss that issue this week at Bloomberg's New Voices event on the island of Martha's Vineyard.
I think that, we are still in the first inning, the infrastructure layer. So these are the companies that are building the data centers. Meta spent $500 billion building data centers. On top of that is the model layer. So these are the ChatGPTs and the Claudes. That battle is for the most part won. So there are big companies there. But the application layer, how does this work in agriculture, in education, in healthcare? I mean, that's 70% of the economy that still is in the process of evolving. And so I think that there's still, I think we've got a long, long glide path.
By all accounts, this was an incredible event. A lot of folks there, and Romain Bostic, our colleague, conducting a number of great interviews on the sidelines of that as well.
I'm going to try to go next year. Also, I've never been to Martha's Vineyard.
Well, good excuse to do so.
Good excuse. All right, coming up, Iceland considers its future and its independence as the country gears up for a vote on possible EU membership talks. That's coming up later on Bloomberg This Weekend, and you can explore live streaming news and interviews, all our TV shows, documentary reports, analysis, all in one place, Bloomberg.com/videos.
Welcome back. On Saturday, the nation of Iceland will hold a national referendum on whether or not to resume membership talks with the European Union. Membership negotiations previously began in 2009, but were put on ice in 2013.
I'm going to leave that. I'm going to leave that one right there. All right. The latest polling data shows the country is split almost down the middle, with 53% of people planning to vote yes and 47% planning to vote no, as Iceland weighs geopolitical pressure with a long history of independence. We talked to Ingo Sigfússon. He's a correspondent at RUV Iceland's National Broadcasting Service about why the country is considering this.
Well, it was actually considered a decade ago. Iceland applied to join, and then after having closed a few chapters on accession talks, sort of decided, we're going to take a pause and see what happens. On one hand, it's because the 2 out of the 3 coalition parties in government right now are pro-EU and want to join, think it's a good move for Iceland and have campaigned on it and are sort of fulfilling their campaign promise. The other is sort of, I guess it has to do with where things are going in the world, even if it's not a huge part of the public discussion. Things are changing around Iceland. We're in the middle of the so-called GIA-UK gap. That is the part of the sea where Russia would need to get through to do anything in the North Atlantic. Let's say, start bugging you guys on the east coast of the US. We've also seen what President Trump was talking about in Greenland. The Arctic is opening up. That's changing the economics of the area. It's also changing just the security and defense discussion. So those are factors perhaps more for the politicians and sort of the chattering classes, if you will, than for the general public. But those are sort of the elements that are on the side of those who want to join are important.
It seems to me, you referenced it a little bit, but the part that people maybe aren't saying out loud as much is, in the current era of uncertainty and uncertain economic policy, especially coming from Washington, are countries like Iceland looking at the EU bloc as some more insurance if they have, if the president wakes up and decides he wants to change tariffs on Icelandic goods or change regulations? Do you have better negotiating powers or safety in numbers?
I think that's certainly part of the discussion. If you look at a small country like Iceland, who sort of historically, even if we're founding members of NATO and have had a bilateral defense agreement with the US since 1951, we've always played that small power card when we needed to. We also negotiated with the Soviet Union when it was in our advantage. But things have changed. You're quite right. And it's sort of public policy that we should have, I think the wording is more pillars to sort of lean on when it comes to security and defense. That's not to say that people are dissing the U.S. The politicians here are making quite sure that they don't say anything that might rub anyone the wrong way on that side of the Atlantic. But it's certainly, I mean, things have changed, and then you need to change. You need to figure out how you have guarantees to the extent that such a thing exists.
You are currently not on the EU. Is that something that would change? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the EU has said that if you vote yes to join, this could potentially be done and wrapped up within the year. Is that reasonable? Is that even feasible?
I mean, people have talked about a year or two. So we're members of the European Economic Area, which means Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, a few other countries are part of this area that is sort of outside the EU, but still accepts, I mean, it depends on how you count it, but up to 70% of EU law anyway. We're a member of the free trade area. So we're sort of in, to a large extent, but without a vote. So that is what would potentially change with joining. That is sort of the big deal, what would change. And of course, then there's the talk of what would we be giving up if we join.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Is it seems to me like you did have the best of both worlds because you had the independence. I mean, people look at Brexit, people complain about the clunkiness of the EU and the bureaucracy. Is it getting to a point where nations like Iceland are more willing to give up some of that independence and some of that freedom for the protection of these larger trading blocs and economic unions because of what's happening in Washington?
I think that's core. That's really the heart of the debate here. That's the core. What are we giving? What are we gaining? Independence and sovereignty are very big for the people sort of that are against joining the EU. They fear giving up power to a centralized great bureaucracy in Brussels, and that will have virtually no say in how things are managed as a tiny nation. Fisheries also being a big part of it sort of goes to how we manage the fishery stocks in the ocean around Iceland. But yes, I mean, what is to be gained? What has to be given up? Of course, parts of the sovereignty would be given up in return for some benefits. It's also fairly likely or almost certain that Iceland would pay more into the common EU funds than we would receive as cash or donations or subventions or whatnot. But it's a very complex arithmetic, isn't it? I mean, what are you paying? What are you giving up? And what are you getting in return? It's important to say that this referendum is actually only about whether we have accession talks with the EU, whether we talk to the EU about what would it look like if we were to join. And then if it's a yes now in August, we'll have those talks for a couple of years. And then at the end of those negotiations, there will be a second referendum to say, do we actually like the deal or not? So in the end, it'll come down to the public, either now or then.
All right. Thanks to Ingo Sigfússon on helping us be a little smarter on that. It's a big issue for this country that has independence is in their constitution. The fact that the vote is this close even is substantial. Fascinating. And also we tend to focus on Ukraine's bid to be a part of the EU. This not getting as much coverage, but certainly merits it. And they're not on the euro, and they would change their currency, so it would be a big deal. All right, we're coming up on 8 o'clock here in New York City. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now. On Bloomberg This Weekend, Canada hits back, saying it will apply dollar-for-dollar tariffs on $20 billion worth of American goods starting next month, as Canada's Prime Minister calls it war. New reaction from President Trump. And Scott Bessent's big moves.
That we are trying to bring the market back into equilibrium.
The Treasury Secretary set to hold a Monday press conference where he'll face questions on the bond market and what the administration is calling an economic D-Day for Iran. Plus, data centers backlash hits the midterms, with candidates on both sides of the aisle making it part of the campaign. We'll talk to Democratic and Republican Congress members about how they see the issue.
So all the worries, all the drummed up alarmism is really bad for the future of America if we don't get this right.
Data centers really becoming one of those single issue votes that people are really paying attention to. All right, welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. It's 8 a.m. in New York from our world headquarters here in Manhattan. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura with Alexis Christoforous, who's in for Lisa Mateo on this Sunday. We are bringing you the latest breaking news, reporting, and analysis here on this Sunday, every Saturday and Sunday from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock Wall Street time. And Christina, I think a lot of people, especially on global Wall Street, poised right now, wondering what we're going to learn from the Treasury Secretary here in the coming days. After his intervention last week, he teased more action to come. We're going to see what that looks like going forward.
That's right. And we need to see how the markets react tomorrow on what's happened with Canada.
Yes,
and,
the tariffs.
You know, we had the big bond up and down last week and see if that persists. So we're going to break it all down.
Yeah, and the Iran D-Day, economic D-Day as well.
That's
teasing
right.
A lot of which is in the kind of purview of the Treasury Secretary.
There's a lot of things to break down. But first, Alexis, what you got with the headlines?
All right, thanks a lot, guys. Good morning. Canada is answering back after the U.S. imposed 50% tariffs on $20 billion worth of Canadian products yesterday, including plywood, liquor, electrical equipment, and hockey gear. Prime Minister Mark Carney says Canada will apply counter tariffs on $20 billion of U.S. products beginning September 8th, escalating the feud, rocking one of the world's biggest trading relationships. Carney said he was left with little choice after trade talks with President Trump's administration broke down Friday night. The Canadian levies will apply to U.S. steel, dairy, appliances, electronics, and more. Residents on Hawaii's Big Island are bracing for heavy rains and gusty winds as tropical storm Moke makes its way through the island. The National Hurricane Center says the storm is not expected to grow as large or powerful as Hurricane Lala, which battered the Big Island last week, and many residents still cleaning up from that one. And it is day 12 without power for tens of thousands of residents in Gary, Indiana, nearly 2 weeks after thunderstorms swept through the state, killing at least 7 people. Hurricane-force winds toppled trees and power lines, and heavy rains flooded neighborhoods. Indiana's Governor Mike Braun is calling on the local power utility to, quote, match the urgency of residents who have had to endure the power outage. NIPSCO Power says it's working around the clock to restore electricity. President Donald Trump made more than 1,000 securities trades in June, including buying shares of Berkshire Hathaway, Visa, MasterCard, and Coinbase. That's all according to a financial disclosure published this weekend. In 2025, Trump made more than 21,000 securities trades, often in bursts tied to market events he created. The White House says there are no conflicts of interest because Trump's investments are entirely made by independent managers. And Wall Street faces a high-stakes week ahead, featuring Fed Chair Kevin Warsh at the Jackson Hole Economic Symposium, where investors will be listening for clues about inflation and the direction of monetary policy. But first, tomorrow, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's going to hold that press conference where he's expected to outline planned U.S. sanctions against Iran. He'll probably also talk about that bond buying program this past week. And representatives for Paramount Skydance are set to meet tomorrow with officials from California to discuss a settlement of the antitrust lawsuit aimed at blocking the media giant's takeover of Warner Brothers Discovery. So a busy week ahead, guys. Don't forget NVIDIA's earnings midweek, another big one.
Oh, my gosh, on Wednesday of this week, right. I believe. Alexis, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
We're going to dig into what Alexis was just teasing there a moment ago. What's going to be a big week here in terms of the economy. Yes, we're going to get to Jackson Hole a little later in the show, but we're going to talk about the bond market first. And grateful to have with us here a man who needs no introduction. One, Tom Keene, of course, the co-anchor of Bloomberg Surveillance, Bloomberg Money as well. Tony Crescenzi joins us as well, portfolio manager at PIMCO. Tony, let me start with you. I just want to get your perspective here. It's been a couple of days since we had the surprise intervention by the Treasury Secretary announcing these changes to the bond buyback program. How are you processing it? How are you thinking about it? What does it signal about Mr. Bessent's approach here to stewarding the U.S. economy?
Well, it's a stabilizer is probably the best way to think about it. And when we think as investors about what to do, we have to really just start with the principle of how to invest and what the fair value is. So how do you determine where a 10-year note should be, where a 30-year bond should be? What does a bond investor actually think? You know, there are a lot of headlines, but we have to still do the math. Think of the movie The Martian, remember? He said, just get to work and do the math. There's really 3 components of a bond yield that an investor thinks about each and every day. And we're focusing a lot on, of course, on this technical operation, but the most important variable in that, and I'll go through each one really quickly, is the inflation component. It's the least variable when we think about what we should be compensated against as investors in a long-term security, because you are in it for a while, 10-year, 30-year period. A 2.5 is pretty reasonable if you think the Federal Reserve is serious about inflation. We're using something like the low 2s in our systems, even though the Fed has a 2% inflation target. Now, I said just a second ago that's the most predictable component of the compensation a bond investor demands when buying a bond. That may seem difficult to imagine these days because inflation has been moving around. But it has been more stable in the old Greenspan, the former Fed chair, and Volcker, also the former Fed chair, who conquered inflation in the 70s. Their old way of determining whether or not the inflation story was in the right place was to think about whether prices were stable, whether they had achieved price stability. There was no number. The Fed established a number under Chair Bernanke in 2012, the 2% inflation target that Kevin Warsh is focused on now. They had a way of thinking about it, and they both said it, Greenspan and Volcker, the same way. They said price stability occurs when price changes cease to influence household and business decision-making. Now, could we say that about the past few years? Probably, because the economy has been pretty good. Look at the stock market. It's been roaring. So that part of it looks pretty good. And I'll go through those others too in 30 seconds. We have the neutral rate. How do you know whether you're at neutral? We'd say that's about 1 point over the inflation rate. How do you know that that's the neutral rate? Maybe it's 2 points. Well, the economy has slowed over time with the Fed's current 3.5-ish policy rate, which suggests that that number is probably right. So about 1 point you want for the neutral rate, the real neutral rate, 2.5-ish for inflation compensation. But the tricky one, the one you're talking about, and everyone is this week, is the uncertainty element, the term premium, the extra yield you get for the uncertainties about many, many things. It's a catch-all. And we say that should be around 1% now. Yeah. So that adds up to something like 4s. And so we're kind of in the fair value zone.
Well, there's
Tony, knowing his audience, by the way, I know you're a huge Martian fan of The Martian, so I just
listen. I followed that. However, there are fewer things I hate more than doing the math, and I'm now adding talking bonds to that list. Okay. All right, Tom, help me understand what Bessent said, because the Treasury Secretary said in an interview with CNBC, "We believe that yields don't reflect the underlying fundamentals." How can that be? David Gura says I should be astonished by that.
I've been doing this for 124 years.
Yeah. He's rounding down. He's rounding down.
Longer than Crescenzi. I have never seen a pile-on like this weekend in the zeitgeist on the Treasury Secretary of the United States of America. Just as one example, Lars Christensen out of Copenhagen with Danske Bank, hugely respected even by people that disagree with his economics, was vicious in a lengthy message this morning about the Treasury Secretary. And there's others as well.
Vicious about the action he took, about his messaging
the arrogance.
on it?
It's about the arrogance of it. In Chairman Warsh's defense, he's got to now completely adjust the body language at Jackson Hole to remove himself from what is perceived by the street, by economists, by finance people, is the arrogance that we saw this week. I'm not saying it was arrogance. I'm saying that's clearly the opinion, David, that we see now.
We had Crescenzi on the show yesterday, Tom, and he said he'd love to be a fly on the wall at the weekly breakfast that the Treasury Secretary and the Fed chair have. As I say, we're going to talk about Jackson Hole a little later in the show in more detail, but talk a bit about that. I mean, we see a Treasury Secretary now, Tom, engaged in yield management, which customarily, historically, traditionally has been the provenance of the Federal Reserve Chairman.
Well, they're two different things, but the basic idea is the Fed is independent, and we still have that independence. I think the check here at Jackson Hole and the check here right now as we staggered a Monday morning, or frankly, Monday morning in Tokyo when they open in Japan, the check is the markets will corral the Treasury Secretary. They don't have to corral the Fed. The Fed is an independent body, and still proven is an independent body. I would suggest the great unspoken here now, and also to get to next Friday and beyond, the great unspoken here are the governors and the presidents of the Fed have a voice. It'll be fascinating to see the body language in the next meeting, the meeting after that, even the post-election meeting. It'll be fascinating to see how the presidents and the governors respond to Bessent and Warsh.
Tony, one of the other things I dislike intensely is that I am now the person at dinner parties who talks about things like bonds and the Fed, and it makes me
Lucky you, right?
It makes me very uncomfortable. However, I was out last night. I was asked by somebody. They said, "Oh, well, I don't care about this bond stuff. I'm not invested in bonds." But we're all kind of invested in bonds, right? Because they are this paragon of stability for so long. And looking what happened at this last week, does it make you look at the U.S. bond market any differently? This is not a place you're supposed to see frequent surprises. Frankly, it shouldn't be interesting enough for us to be leading this hour
Come
with.
up at dinner parties.
Well, I'm not saying my dinner parties are barn burner, but you can all attend for yourselves and let me know.
Well, it's important right now. Investors have an opportunity, and they should be thinking about it this way. I like to call it the double, to join what I call the double lock club. Americans are very astute when mortgage rates decline to lock in low mortgage rates for 30-year period. They could be just as astute now if they believe that there's value in the bond market in locking in higher interest rates because on the interest that they receive. Because today, these days, in high-quality bonds and in portfolios, what I mean is a AA type portfolio, you could earn between 5 and 7% or so. AA means historically, according to the rating agencies, 99.98% chance of getting your money back. So the value proposition still is quite good. And to Tom's point, the Fed presidents, the Fed governors, they are part of a contingent that for 40 years has protected the bond investor against the ravages of inflation, the key nemesis of the bond market. And I'm reminded of a story I read in the Fed's oral history project of the early 2000s, an interview with Nancy Teeters, who joined the Fed in the late 1970s. She joined when G. William Miller was Fed chair for about a year or so. He was outvoted, by the way, at a couple of Fed meetings. She said that he thought he could do whatever he wanted. Yeah. That he didn't realize he had to go through us. And so that's the way it's shaping up. One quick thing, Tom. One question we might have going forward is, will the Fed become, and I doubt it, a Bank of England styled governance where the Fed chair is in the minority?
Exactly.
It's possible, but I wouldn't.
It's
amazing.
Put
my money on that.
Crescenzi's brilliant on a Saturday. I don't know how
Sunday's
he does
a
that.
Sunday.
The heart of the matter is,
it's even more impressive.
Not to turn this into a history lesson. I don't want to ruin.
The only other person who's read the oral history of the Federal Reserve besides Tony Crescenzi, Tom Keene, took them all to the beach.
Alan Meltzer 101. It's almost as thick as Crescenzi's classic.
I checked myself and had an adult moment and did not make fun of that.
What Tony says there is so important, and it alludes to Jackson Hole the next hour with Henrietta, which is this is an international meeting. And everybody's looking at the very young Bank of England, its independence, the young Bank of England, where they love dissent. I believe Catherine Mann will be at Jackson Hole.
Okay.
Are we going to get that independent mind, such as Professor Mann of Tufts, Brandeis, I believe Brandeis? Are we going to get a Catherine Mann tone at the meeting and in the future from our presidents and governors to put the Treasury Secretary in his place?
Tony, let me ask you about the dollar, if I could. So in that interview that the Secretary gave with Sarah Eisen, Tom's old sparring partner now at the Death Star, as he would say, he kind of dismissed concerns about the dollar, dismissed concerns about the market movements that we saw in the aftermath of that intervention on Wednesday. What do you make of what we've seen in the dollar, the strength of the dollar? He said, once again, he maintains the U.S. has a strong dollar policy. How much is this something that you're going to be watching for here as we get to the opening trade on Monday?
Well, if you look at my name, it has a vowel at the end. I'm Italian. Early in the year, I was in Italy. A week after that, I was sitting in my New York office several feet from Mario Draghi, the famous central bank, the famous president of the European Central Bank. And we were talking about the dollar, and there's a lot of questions around that time. You might recall Liberation Day and the swoon in the dollar, the bonds and stocks all fell at the same time, which is rare. And basically, he said, we asked him, and this is a terrible analogy since someone from Italy, we asked me, are we in late innings with the dollar and all the money that flows into it? The soccer analogy or football would have been better. But anyway, he said, understanding, of course, the U.S. Tradition, I said, no, not late innings. And he cited what's in focus at Jackson Hole, the payment system, and the vast amount of securities and other transactions that are continued to be conducted in dollars. And that, plus the depth of the U.S. markets, which will stay high and well above other markets for a long time. And also the unison of markets in that the U.S. has a single stock market, whereas, as he said, they envy that in Europe. those who issue have IPOs, for example, in the initial public offerings in the equity markets there. So the focus should be on other things than this attempt to manage interest rates, which is whether or not the U.S. is getting its house in order, but whether or not the dollar will remain the dominant currency used in the payment system. So a lot of that will come out on Friday.
Where I am on this, then it's almost a triangulation of dollar and inflation, all these other narratives we have. We have a boom economy, David. We have an economy, Christina, that's like a banana republic, 5%, 6%, 7% nominal GDP. And all this architecture of angst, if that nominal GDP comes down, that animal spirit comes down, things become a lot more fragile fast. I don't hear that in third quarter of 2026. Maybe I don't even hear it in fourth quarter, but a lot of the different conversations we have, like with Tiffany Wilding at PIMCO, is what happens when nominal GDP pulls back, almost like the water, the emperor in the water and all that. But the question is, what happens when we slow down, given these bond stresses, these inflation stresses?
We've got about 60 seconds left.
Most dangerous things you could say to Tom.
I know. I'm
yeah.
taking it down to 30. Faith in the dollar. Is it still durable?
Yes, the dollar. Yeah, I totally 100% agree with Mr. Crescenzi. The dollar, I push aside all the dollar gloom. I will say, looking at the Bloomberg Dollar Index, that it was an ugly week. And if we get follow through to a weaker dollar, you see stress on yen, stress on euro, but far more emerging market. Philippine peso almost hit a 62. That's untenable for the Philippine community.
First reference to the Philippine peso on Bloomberg this weekend.
I learned so much from the new men in my life.
No, that's all right. Tony Crescenzi, thank you very much. Of course, portfolio manager at PIMCO. Tom Keene is going to come back a little later on the show. Please. Henrietta Treyz of Veda Partners is going to join us. He and she are going to talk with us more about Jackson Hole. Tom's going to make his way there. The covered wagon leaves in a few minutes here from Lexington Avenue. He'll be riding out to
maybe
Jackson,
I'll go
Wyoming.
Get a coffee. All right, coming up, President Trump pulls back from South Korea and cozies up to Kim Jong-un. That's straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Alexis Christoforous. Let's update you now on today's top stories. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney says he had little choice but to impose retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. after the Trump administration slapped a 50% surcharge yesterday on $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, everything from wine to hockey sticks. Carney says Canada will retaliate dollar for dollar beginning September 8th, targeting sectors including steel, dairy, appliances, and agricultural equipment. Trade talks between the longtime allies broke down Friday night, and both the U.S. and Canada now face the risk of a full-scale trade war. And now to a Bloomberg exclusive. Some of NVIDIA's biggest customers have been told that the prices of servers containing its artificial intelligence chips are going up by more than 15% in many cases. That's because of the soaring cost of memory chips. The price hikes will go into effect on systems shipped early next year and will impact systems including those with the flagship Vera Rubin and Grace Blackwell chips. Major tech companies, including Apple and Qualcomm, have recently said they've been forced to charge more for their products because of those chip shortages. And now it is the moon's turn to pull a disappearing act. North and South America will get a front row seat to a near total lunar eclipse. That's going to happen Thursday into Friday of this week. That's when the Earth's shadow will briefly envelop 96% of the moon, making this an especially deep partial eclipse. Scientists say it is the second act of the greatest show in the solar system. Just 2 weeks ago, the moon moved directly between Earth and the sun, creating that spectacular solar eclipse. Not here so much, but they saw it in Greenland, Iceland, and parts of Spain.
So it's a total eclipse of the moon.
Yes,
96%. Of the moon.
96% eclipse of the moon.
Bonnie Hart.
Bonnie Tyler.
Bonnie Tyler. I know.
I got you.
Yeah, thank you for getting me. She passed away recently.
That's very sad. That's right.
Well, her spirit lives on in an excellent refrain. Thanks, Alexis.
You just gave us your rendition of.
It was less than excellent, but it had some spirit. All right.
I certainly will not.
Let's move on for our audience's sake.
All right, thank you. Well, tensions are rising in the Asia-Pacific after President Trump announced he would be, quote, substantially reducing joint military exercises with South Korea. In a Truth Social post, the president wrote, "Based on my very good relationship with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, I'm not happy with the fact that the United States has long ago agreed to participate in joint military exercises with South Korea. These exercises are not only costly, with much of these costs paid for by the United States of America, as usual, exclamation mark, but send a signal that is totally inappropriate and hostile to a country that, as long as Donald J. Trump has been president, has been unthreatening and respectful, end quote.
Yeah, I'm glad that was your read and not mine. Okay, President Trump says he's hoping to meet with Kim Jong-un this year. And the White House says the North Korean leader has responded to requests to talk, but North Korea has denied there's been any direct communication and appears unmoved, sometimes openly hostile by the Trump administration's overtures. For more, we sat down with Bloomberg's senior geoeconomics analyst for the Asia Pacific, Adam Farrer, to discuss how South Korea was really blindsided by this decision.
Absolutely. So I think that announcement caught everyone by surprise. And when I say everyone, I include U.S. Forces Korea and the Korean government that were responsible for these exercises that were actually starting, in some cases, within minutes of the release of his message on Truth Social on Sunday night, given the time difference and the fact that the exercises started in the morning on Monday in Korea. And they're part of a large series of exercises that are done between the United States and Korea to maintain readiness in the face of the growing North Korean threat. And they're incredibly important because they help deal with the reality that there are two forces operating, the United States and Korea, in any sort of contingency situation. And they help train towards the reality of kind of the missile and nuclear threat. In particular, this time, it was actually focused heavily on the lessons learned by North Korean forces fighting against Ukrainian forces and the likelihood that South Korea could see some of those same tactics, the heavy use of drones and other tools against them in a future scenario. And yet, the president's words led to a really rapid shift that led the South Korean and U.S. forces to decide on cutting the exercise back by half and actually ending it at the defensive side of the exercise and not moving towards the counterattack elements that are necessary for any sort of contingency scenario.
You said growing North Korea threat. Let me drill down on that a little bit. Look, we've been focused so much on what's happening in Europe and the Middle East. Indeed, how strong or dangerous is that threat right now?
So Kim Jong-un, since he came to power in 2011, has made it his ambition to truly solidify North Korea as a nuclear state. And that has meant both building out his nuclear weapons capability, and we've seen that in a series of tests going through the last decade, but also the delivery systems that are required to actually put those weapons on target. And that's been the advancement of a wide range of ballistic missile technology, which he has tested effectively and aggressively, particularly since 2017. And we actually also saw him deploy some of this technology in support of Russia with North Korean missiles raining down on Ukrainian targets. And not only were they being used in that environment, the North Koreans had the opportunity to learn from firing them in a contested environment and improve those weapons. And all of that now sits, in North Korea and is improving on a day-to-day basis. And while Kim is unlikely to necessarily use them on South Korea or Japan in the near term, it means he has this tool at his disposal. And when he is interested in being more coercive and pushing for his objectives, he can leverage them effectively.
We also had this kind of striking moment where the president came out and said, he put a number on the number of nuclear weapons that he says he thinks North Korea has. He said 57. ROK, South Korea debates that. They say it could be up to 120. I find it very interesting because when I was trying to get that answer out of people like you in positions at the NSC, you never wanted to put a number on that. How significant is it to have the head of state disclosing an intelligence estimate like that? Is it accurate? And then what is the capacity of the program? I know in the past the delivery systems have been not great, but as you said, they've been learning a lot from the Russians and technology has advanced. What's the size of the program and how threatening is it, I guess?
So it certainly was surprising to see the president use a very specific number, but I would, emphasize that he has actually used several different numbers over the past couple of years, and so it's really unclear what he was referring to. And as you said, the South Koreans actually think the number is more than double what he had said. So I think the takeaway is that the number of North Korean nuclear weapons is large and growing. And more importantly, the delivery systems, as you mentioned as well, are evolving and improving every time North Korea is able to test their ballistic missiles, as it just did this week in response likely to the ongoing exercises. And there are these ongoing questions on whether they've tested enough so that a weapon would actually survive re-entry through the atmosphere in a ballistic trajectory. And certainly, that there's a question mark there. But so far, what they're proving is that they have the expertise to deliver the weapons to their intended targets, most likely. And with their growing relationship with Moscow, there is the potential of military technology transfer that could allow them to leapfrog those research and development milestones.
I want to ask you about the prospects of there being a renewed dialogue between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. So we had Summit 1, Summit 2, very little to show for either of those here. But the president still continues to have this obsession with having some kind of familiar relationship with the North Korean dictator. What do you make of that, and do you see the third time potentially as being the charm?
So there's no doubt that President Trump really values his personal relationship with Kim Jong-un. I think he marvels in the unique nature of it, the fact that he's one of the few world leaders that has been able to maintain it, particularly from the United States. And he's talked about it, kind of nonstop since he returned to office. And on the North Korean front, in his defense, we have seen relatively positive words about the personal relationship between Kim Jong-un and President Trump. But at the same time, they've pushed back on the idea that there is any chance of major dialogue in the near term, because from their perspective, they're looking for a major change in U.S. policy, and they continually refer to the end of U.S. hostile policy. And that's not just the words that we use, but actually the way we interact in the region. And by some definitions, it's actually the U.S. alliance with South Korea. So there are a lot of barriers to moving forward. And while, certainly we shouldn't count out the possibility that Kim Jong-un might accept some sort of meeting with President Trump, who, in his unorthodox nature, would probably be willing to show up without much planning, the odds of there being any real breakthrough are very low. What Kim Jong-un wants is full recognition of his nuclear power and status, and a return to kind of normal operations in the world, a removal of all sanctions. And while, certainly it's possible that President Trump might go down that route, the national security apparatus in the United States, and more importantly in Korea and Japan, would push really hard to stop that from happening. And with Kim feeling really secure about his position, given his support from Russia, he's not in a rush right now.
Adam, really quickly, we've got about a minute before I let you go, but I do want to talk about how, you just talked about how this is related and involved with Ukraine and Russia, but it also impacts the conflict in Iran, and we're seeing the U.S. repositioning some assets to try to pursue their goals there. We've all been around long enough to survive so many pivots to Asia, and every time it seems like administrations get pulled back into conflicts elsewhere. But what does that mean? What does this mean, and what is being repositioned to go fight in the Middle East?
So, the headline recently is the movement of the United States aircraft carrier from the Indo-Pacific to Iran, to the Middle East, to replace the USS Abraham Lincoln that was on one of the longest deployments in its history. And the George Washington has arrived, and that's created actually one of the few carrier gaps or times where there is no U.S. carrier operating operationally in the Pacific. I think based on our estimates, it's only the third time in this century that has happened. And, while in and of itself, that doesn't change the reality for many, allies in the sense that there's no immediate threat, it does raise questions about the enduring ability of the United States to live up to its defense commitments. And that carrier group is not the only, military asset that's moved. We've had at least 5 destroyers that are based in Japan, all operating now in support of the Iran conflict. We had Patriot and THAAD interceptors, those key air defense missiles that have been so essential to defending against ballistic missiles, moved out of the Indo-Pacific, where they're supposed to be guarding against North Korean and Chinese missiles, to the forces in Iran. And that, adds on top of all of the stress in the relationship that has been caused by the trade policies of the administration, and a general focus on other parts of the world, like the Western Hemisphere. And that raises real questions from allies and partners about the enduring legacy of the United States and its ability to live up to its commitments.
Adam, thank you very much. Appreciate it. In your past life, you were there for every pivot to Asia that we've had here in recent years. You've gone to a lot of these summits. When President Trump in the first term was trying to make inroads.
The first one was Singapore. The second one was Vietnam. And then there was this third kind of unexpected thing where they held hands and walked across the Korean border, the cement barrier at the DMZ.
Demilitarized.
So I was there for the last 2. The one in Vietnam, people were so excited. And if you remember, Kim had taken that train in because it's the only way he can travel for hours and hours and hours.
Train.
And there's this Metropole hotel downtown Hanoi, and it was this fancy lunch, was all set up. Everybody was all ready to go. And then the talks fell apart before the lunch. He got back on the train and
wrote it back.
They were out of there. I would not have wanted to be in that train car on the way back. But it's fascinating to me with everything going on in the world that we're back to North Korea yet again, that the president is trying to make this happen yet again.
Yeah, one wonders what's appealing about it. Maybe it's the kind of perceived uncrackability of it, that the president likes the challenge of doing that. I mean, we hear a lot of him talking about the personal relationships as much as they have one that has developed here, but it does seem like this is an intractable thing that he wants to give a go at.
He wants it to happen. You know, he needs a win, and he does feel like he has a relationship with Kim, so never say never.
All right,
you
we'll
never
see
know.
what happens here. All right, coming up here, a tragic death in London and a family's investigation into their son's secret life. We talked to best-selling author Patrick Radden Keefe about his new book, London Falling, making waves all around the world. That's coming next here on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. Stay with us.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Alexis Christoforous. Let's update you on today's top stories. President Trump is set to wave the green flag at today's historic Freedom 250 Indy car race in Washington, D.C. Trump and First Lady Melania will lead a pre-race lap in the presidential limo before watching the open-wheel race zoom past iconic national monuments along Pennsylvania Avenue at speeds approaching 200 miles per hour. There will also be a pre-race show and a flyover of military aircraft. The Indy car race is just the latest of President Trump's celebrations to mark America's 250th birthday. And Fan Week at the U.S. Open kicks off today at Arthur Ashe Stadium here in New York City. The free week of events leading up to the tournament includes a once-in-a-lifetime exhibition game Tuesday that's going to feature 4 tennis legends. Roger Federer and Andy Roddick will team up to play a doubles match against Andre Agassi and John McEnroe. At this year's tournament, Carlos Alvarez is favored to win the men's singles, especially now that the former favorite Jannik Sinner dropped out of the U.S. Open due to a knee injury. Aryna Sabalenka is favored to win the women's title. And Chinese humanoid robots broke records set by humans yesterday, including beating Usain Bolt's 100-meter sprint world record on opening day of the World Humanoid Robot Games in Beijing. That is a thing, and you're looking at it live right now. The 5 days of games demonstrate China's progress in advanced robotics. It features more than 2,000 humanoid robots competing in over 50 events, including table tennis and soccer.
I could just watch this all day.
Could you really?
They're so serious about it. I mean, like the athletes, the Android athletes are something to watch, but also just like the whole team around them taking it so seriously.
When you see them marching through all the robots,
Ominous.
it's a little bit creepy.
Filling that arena. It's a view of the Olympics in 2046 or something like that.
Thanks, Alexis. We're going to move on because I hate this
Keep our eye on that
story.
footage, though. It's been 7 years since British teenager Zach Brettler jumped to his death from the balcony of a luxury tower in London. His family didn't think he'd take his own life, and it was only after his death they found out that he'd been claiming to be the son of a rich Russian oligarch.
That's right. It's a fascinating story. Patrick Radden Keefe is the best-selling author behind Say Nothing, and his new book digs into Breitler's mysterious death in London Falling. We started by asking him how he first heard about this story.
It came to me in the strangest way. That book, Say Nothing, was made into a television drama.
Okay.
And I was a producer on the show, and I was living in London with my family while we made it. And I was on set one day, and I got to chatting with a guy. I was literally doing the Wordle on my phone, and a guy sat down next to me. But I think it's good for, if you're a reporter, to be curious and start conversations with strangers. So
Always.
I started chatting with this guy, and he figured out that I write for The New Yorker, and I write these kind of investigative narrative pieces. And he said, I might have a story for you. And what he said was, there's a family here in London that I'm very close with, and they, in 2019, had this tragedy. They lost a son. Their 19-year-old son, Zach, died in mysterious circumstances. He went off the building of a luxury apartment building and died in the Thames, in the river there. And after he died, his parents made this shocking discovery. They learned that, unbeknownst to them, he had had a secret double life, and he had been pretending that he was the son of a Russian oligarch. And this guy had said about that much to me, and I knew if the family will talk with me, I'm in. I have to write about this.
It is a crazy story, and I was just in the UK, and I told you before you came on, all of my friends with school-age children are now reading this book, especially given the boarding school culture and the day school culture in the UK. This is an upper middle-class family. The parents are children of Holocaust survivors, prominent rabbis. One was even on television for a while. They send their kids to a good school, maybe not the best of the best, but like a top school. And you have these two brothers. One does slightly better than the other, and the other just can't ever seem to think that he's good enough and ends up getting obsessed with, at this era, talk about what's going on in this era in London with this Russian money and this influx of oligarchs' kids, and he just wants that life and kind of starts pretending that he is that kid.
Yeah, that's one of the kind of strange aspects of this story is this boy, Zach Bretler, was born in the year 2000, so he's a real child of the millennium, and he comes of age at a time when London is changing. There's a huge amount of foreign wealth coming into London. There's a lot more conspicuous consumption, luxury real estate. There's a whole kind of blingy
Right, we're going
vibe.
away from like mud-splattered Land Rovers and muck boots and tweed, and
it's
more
much
like
more sort of new money ostentation. And then, he's also kind of a social media native. He grows up on Instagram. And so if you have those kinds of preoccupations, if, as he was, you're interested in supercars and luxury apartments and that kind of thing, and you're just scrolling, you start to see more and more of that stuff. And he became really obsessed with wealth. And one of the ironies is that his family is pretty comfortable. I mean, they lived in a nice neighborhood. They had a big apartment.
These are nice schools they're sending them to.
His father works in finance. They goes to a fancy private school. But in comparison to the children of oligarchs who were at school with him, he felt poor. He felt as though he didn't have enough. And so part of what this story is about is that kind of sense of anxiety he felt. And then his desire as a teenager to kind of con his way into that next level.
The story is about this kid and this young man. It's also about what's happening in London. You follow some of these characters around this real estate boom. But it's also just kind of a story about parenting and how little you can know someone that you've raised from infancy. I mean, you've got two boys. Was that really the crux of why you ended up pursuing this and what you think the heart of it is?
Yeah, I mean, this was something that kind of, listen, on the front end, I was drawn to it because it's kind of a mystery, right? It's sort of a thriller. It's really a story about...
And you still don't really solve it. I mean, you have ideas,
well, I think I roughly know what happened. But it's a story about these parents basically who are trying to investigate their kid's death. And they have to sort of become detectives and figure out what's going on. What snuck up on me as I was working on it is that it really is a story about parenting and about adolescence today and what it's like to see, one of these people who you feel like you know really well, you love them the most in the world, they live under your roof, you raise them, but they kind of turn into a bit of a stranger, and sort of coming to terms with that and trying to figure out, in Zach's case, not just the mystery of how he died, but the mystery of who he really was when he was alive.
You worked with the family very closely for this book. The case made headlines when the death happened, and they have been very critical of the police investigation and how this all went on. How are they doing? Are they okay with all this publicity? Has it made it harder? How are they?
I think they're doing all right. I texted with them this morning. I talk with them all the time. When we launched the book here at the 92nd Street Y in New York back in April, they actually came and they were in the room, not just the parents, but also Zach's brother, Joe. And so I think they feel good about the process of having opened up to me in this way. It is inescapably weird to be in London and see the book in shop windows, to know that people are reading about your family's tragedy, on the beach during the summer. That's a strange
Or listening
experience.
to it on my run.
Yeah, exactly. But having said that, they are an uncommonly resilient family, and part of what the story is also about is learning to keep moving and keep living in the face of loss.
Talk about how you found this book.
I'm
Recommended?
a fan of his previous book, so I think I just saw that he'd written a new one, and I picked it up and I read it, and then when I went over to stay with the friends I was staying with, I walked out in their garden and both the wife and the husband were reading separate copies of it together, because everyone in this world is reading this book right now because it's just so zeitgeisty. And as he talks about, it is about what happened to this family. It is about this kid, but it is also about how you can really not know your own child, and that's the really startling part of this.
Phenomenal book he wrote on the Sackler family. Of course, that was very influential. And Say Nothing, this book about sisters in Northern Ireland, made into he's become this kind of celebrity writer of a sort, and he's very self-effacing, both chatting with you and in other interviews. But all of his books have just been astonishingly good.
I told him before we started the interview, they're annoyingly good. Like, they're books that you read as somebody who, like, tries to write even our own copy. And the prose is so clear and crisp, you don't notice it, which to me is the hallmark of, like, a really good writer. It's always about the story, and his characters are really well established and formed, and the narratives are really, really good.
And a heck of a reporter as well. Some peril involved in reporting a lot of these stories.
I don't know how he gets these out so quickly, because there is so much reporting and so many interviews that he has to do. I don't know when he sleeps, but I'm feeling very professionally inadequate having done that interview.
I've been meaning to read it, and this has prompted me to do it. Very
Aren't
good.
you're going on a fun
Vacation.
trip?
I'll take it with me.
Well, that's what he was saying. It is an odd vacation read, yes. But I did it as well. All right. Coming up, it has been 5 years since the Taliban retook control of Afghanistan and the U.S. withdrew. Up next, Michelle Hussein talks to us about her interview with former Afghan President Hamid Karzai, including why he still lives there and how he engages with the Taliban. If you're heading out the door, take us with us no matter you go. Watch on Bloomberg TV, listen on Bloomberg Radio, stream us live on Bloomberg Business app. We are Bloomberg This Weekend. We'll be right back.
This month marks 5 years since the Taliban retook control of Afghanistan. Thousands of people tried to board planes out of the country, and there was a deadly terror attack. That airport used to be called the Hamid Karzai International Airport after the country's former president.
That's right. We spoke to our colleague Michelle Hussein, host of the Michelle Hussein Show, who interviewed Karzai.
Did you consider going to the airport and getting on one of those planes? Because you could have done.
No, I did not consider that. I was approached by some friendly governments a day before that and weeks before that they would provide us a plane in case of things like that happened, that me and my family would be taken out to those capitals. I refused. I said, no, I will not leave.
And have you had cause to regret that? Because 5 years on, as you said, the power sharing did not happen.
No.
Women are not working. Girls, as you know for yourself and your own family, have to learn at home because they're not able to go to school after the age of 12?
No. I rather am very happy I didn't do that. This is our home, this country. And you don't leave your home when things go difficult. You stay on and get it corrected.
Michelle, it's so interesting to me because I do wonder what influence, if any, Karzai still has in the country, and if there is reason for hope. I mean, I covered the fall of Kabul. I know you did as well, and it just seems to be getting progressively worse, especially for women and girls. But what were your main takeaways, and what can he do?
I mean, Christina, his sense of conviction that things will change in Afghanistan in due course is really striking. But it's hard to look at the situation and have the same kind of quiet confidence or certainty that he portrays in this conversation. You know, the background is one where millions of people in this country live completely dependent on the humanitarian aid that does still come in through aid agencies and the UN, etc. The restrictions on women working has a cost to the economy that's been estimated at $84 million a year. So it's very significant. And then Karzai's own personal circumstances. He is the man who helped oust the Taliban in the aftermath of 9/11. Nearly 25 years ago now, and now he lives under their rule. So his own is a precarious and I imagine uncomfortable position. He can't leave his home without the Taliban's permission. He has to tell them where he wants to go, who he wants to meet. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they don't. I would describe that as a form of house arrest. These were not words he use, but that it's the term I would describe. So it is a picture of a difficult situation for the country as a whole and for him himself and his family, certainly.
And he has young daughters, and they are still there, I assume, but they can no longer go to school. I mean, what is life like for them? I'm sure, given his contacts, he could get out and his family could get out. And as you said, they could have gotten out. I mean, it was hard to get people to the airport, but it was doable. Is he committed to having his family stay?
and the privileged people who had the connections that he had, it would have been possible in those days. So 5 years ago, I remember seeing this video that he released as the Taliban were approaching Kabul to retake the capital city. And there was a video with his 3 then small daughters around him. And he was urging the country to keep calm. But of course, it was very striking that he put his children in that image. And of course, then I was curious to ask about those girls 5 years on. And the eldest one has now passed the age of 12. That's the point where girls in Afghanistan can no longer go out to school. So she is learning at home. The same fate is going to befall the younger ones. And I asked about that because, you know, imagine what that does to you as a parent. So he did talk about that, and he said that he's determined not to send his children overseas to complete their education, because if he does that, it is an acknowledgement of these difficulties in access. It is giving up, in his words, on a future where education within Afghanistan is accessible to all the children of his country. So I think that there is a lot of pain surrounding that.
But there is this very rigorous debate about what to do about the aid, because a lot of the aid was predicated on the ability of women to continue working in these offices, especially the United Nations offices, some of these NGO. They said, you know, if you get rid of women's, you know, if women can't work here, you can't have the aid. But the people who suffer most from the lack of aid are often women and children. So it's this very terrible choice. Do you give the aid to a regime that is doing these horrible things, knowing it will at least keep women and children from starving to death? Or by doing so, are you facilitating longer suffering of the population overall? Did he have an opinion on what to do about that?
It's a moral dilemma, and I think the aid relationship is really important, and no one in a position like his wants to say no. You know, that's the line, the providing for the population's most basic needs, that's the line you should draw. The line he draws is the one about formal relationships with the Taliban. Only Russia has formally recognized the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. And Hamid Karzai tells me that women being able to go to work, girls being able to go to school, that is the condition that only after that's met should other governments recognize the Taliban. But the reality is that in many embassies, as many as 40 different countries around the world, representatives of the Taliban are in control of those Afghan embassies. So de facto, that relationship with foreign governments is to some extent there, or at least they are the ones who have taken over their embassies in about 40 countries. So that, again, is one of the grim realities of all of this. And it's important to say that Hamid Karzai does continue to talk to some members of the Taliban. He told me some of them come to see him at his home in Kabul, the place that he talked to us from. And those that come to see me, they do believe, like me, that the restrictions on women should ease and that girls should go back into secondary schooling. But of course, there are other members of the Taliban leadership, including the supreme leader, who are the ones who take the most hardline views.
Coming up on Bloomberg this weekend, Canada hits back, saying it will apply dollar-for-dollar tariffs on $20 billion worth of American goods starting next month, as Canada's Prime Minister calls it war. New reaction from President Trump.
And Scott Bessent's big moves.
That we are trying to bring the market back into equilibrium.
The Treasury Secretary set to hold a Monday press conference where he'll face questions on the bond market and what the administration is calling an economic D-Day for Iran.
Plus, data centers backlash hits the midterms, with candidates on both sides of the aisle making it part of the campaign. We'll talk to Democratic and Republican Congress members about how they see the issue.
So all the worries, all the drummed up alarmism is really bad for the future of America if we don't get this right.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York City. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Alexis Christoforous and for Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, August 23rd. And we've had a lot of news to sort through this weekend, as per usual. It
Yes.
doesn't seem like we're getting a lot of slow news weekends.
No,
a lot
it's
happens
supposed to
on
be
Fridays.
A sleepy summer Sunday. In fact, is not that. We're getting new detail here on the way that these talks between the U.S. and Canada broke down on Friday night, late into the evening, and the president weighing in on this in the early hours of this morning, writing on Truth Social here. Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one, 3 exclamation marks. We've also charged our great farmers for many years massive amounts of tariffs. No more. Again, 3 exclamation marks. So again, we're kind of putting together this narrative of what happened, but it sounds like there was dispute over, yes, trucks, also efforts here to kind of call into question the sovereignty of Canada.
And who was really in charge from the negotiating standpoint from the U.S.? There seems to be some debate about who was driving these talks and whether they had competing interests. But first, let's go to Alexis. She can break down for us.
And that's where we begin this morning, guys. Thank you. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney says he had little choice but to impose retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. after the Trump administration slapped a 50% surcharge yesterday on $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, everything from wine to hockey sticks. Carney says Canada will retaliate dollar for dollar beginning September 8th, targeting sectors including steel, dairy, appliances, and agricultural equipment. Trade talks between the longtime allies broke down Friday night, and both the U.S. and Canada now face the risk of a full-scale trade war. Residents on Hawaii's Big Island are bracing for heavy rains and gusty winds as Tropical Storm Moke makes its way through the island. The National Hurricane Center says the storm is not expected to grow as large or powerful as Hurricane Lala, which battered the Big Island last weekend. Many residents are still cleaning up from that storm. And it is day 12, believe it or not, without power for tens of thousands of residents in Gary, Indiana, nearly 2 weeks after thunderstorms swept through the state, killing at least 7 people. Hurricane-force winds toppled trees and power lines, and heavy rains flooded neighborhoods. Indiana Governor Mike Braun is calling on the local power utility to, quote, match the urgency of residents who have had to endure the power outage. NIPSCO Power says it is working around the clock to restore electricity. President Donald Trump made more than 1,000 securities trades in June, including buying shares of Berkshire Hathaway, Visa, MasterCard, and Coinbase. This is according to a financial disclosure published this weekend. In all of 2025, Trump made more than 21,000 securities trades. They were often in bursts tied to market events he created. The White House says there's no conflict of interest because Trump's investments are entirely made by independent managers. And Wall Street certainly faces a high-stakes week ahead featuring Fed Chair Kevin Warsh. He'll be at the Jackson Hole Economic Symposium. Investors are going to be listening for clues about inflation and the direction of monetary policy. Tomorrow, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent will hold a press conference where he's expected to outline planned U.S. sanctions against Iran. And representatives for Paramount Skydance are set to meet tomorrow with officials from California. They're going to discuss a settlement of the antitrust lawsuit aimed at blocking the media giant's takeover of Warner Brothers Discovery. And every day they don't do it, I think it costs them a little bit more. Right?
Yes, millions and millions of dollars. So they're a huge incentive to get this done.
We're still waiting. It's been
All
a
right.
while. Thanks,
Alexis, thank you very much. 73 days until voters head to the polls for the midterm elections, and data centers have become the, quote, sleeper issue for the entire election cycle. That's according to a National Republican Senatorial Committee memo obtained by Axios. For some context here, 71% of Americans oppose construction of data centers in their neighborhoods, compared with 53% who oppose the construction of nuclear power plants.
And this Washington Post analysis shows the drop-off in positive talk about data centers since April 2024, and that's from both parties. But the centers have a booster in the White House.
Well, the data center subject to me is a pretty simple one. If you pick the right location, and it's got to be, not every location is perfect for it, but you pick the right location, what it means for a community is jobs and lots of money and lower taxes. And the data centers now are mandated by me that they build their own electricity, so they're not taking it from the grid. If I were a community, I would want the data center. It means jobs, it means income, and it means lower taxes.
This morning, we're talking to a congressional Republican and a congressional Democrat about the issue. Joining us now up first is Representative Greg Landsman. He's a Democrat from Ohio who sits on the Energy and Commerce Committees. All right, what is your take on this? Because ahead of November, there's a lot of issues voters are worried about, mostly what we talked about, those kitchen table issues, affordability, pricing, be able to, succeed and have their kids be successful. But this seems to feed into some of those concerns. And what are you hearing from your constituents? I read there are more than 200 data centers in Ohio right now. That's according to Pew.
Yeah, I mean, data centers, it's been a huge issue for a while now. So the idea that it's a sleeper issue is just a sleeper issue for them. I don't think they were paying attention, though they, were hearing it, hopefully, from their constituents. This is a huge problem, in part because people are so frustrated with the economy the way it is, where you have the super wealthy, they get whatever they want, they can do whatever they want. And you're seeing that play out with the data centers and these big tech companies that are getting tax cuts to build these data centers. So politicians are giving them cash, even though they're the richest people and the richest companies in the world. They come in to our towns, they sign NDAs with elected officials, non-disclosure agreements, so that the elected officials can't talk about it. And then, they create some jobs. The challenge is that they also jack up everyone's utility bills. So it's a huge issue because it hits people's pocketbooks, right? Like they're paying more, and Ohioans are paying more in electric bills. And it gets at this unevenness, brokenness of the economy, where the super wealthy get whatever they want and we all pay more.
Congressman, when you go to the first district, as I have, you look at Cincinnati, yes, there's the beauty of the Ohio River. There are also a lot of warehouses there. This is a real locus for distribution warehouses and has been for a long time, both Cincinnati and Covington, Kentucky. Is there an appetite for building these things in and around the first district? What do you hear from your constituents about it?
Yeah, they're trying to build one in a part of the new first congressional district. It got gerrymandered even further. So Wilmington is in the new Ohio one. And so I've spent a lot of time up there with them. They are trying to stop a big data center coming in, or at least slow it down so that they can get their priorities included in whatever deal gets done. But again, this was done behind closed doors. Everyone signed an NDA. They refused to talk to their constituents. They got a tax cut from the federal government, Amazon. They got a tax cut from the state government. So they got a lot of money. And what people are hearing is this is going to increase their utility bills based on what's happened around other places. And so what I hear is if they pay their own way, and they do everything above board publicly, and we get a say, that's one thing. But this, the way they're doing it, is wrong.
You've also introduced legislation. You've got a bill that's gotten out of committee that would put the cost burden for energy consumption on the data centers, not the tax base. And it would do something you were just referencing. It would ban NDAs with elected officials. I don't think a lot of people realize that that's a thing. But as I pull it up here, I'm seeing several different local news articles from Pennsylvania to Louisiana where local officials report or have been reported on having signed non-disclosure agreements with these companies. It seems to me if they're doing that, they know they're unpopular. How common is this? And do you think this bill will get any traction?
I've never seen an NDA. I've been an elected official for almost
I didn't know that was a thing. Yeah, I've covered Congress a long time. I didn't realize this was happening.
I've never heard of it in any context. And maybe there's NDAs that sign with like city officials or state officials because there's some, trade-related issue. I don't know, but I've never seen it. And in Ohio, we pride ourselves in doing everything, in the light of day. We have really serious sunshine laws that require everything to be public. And these guys have been going around, these tech companies, signing NDAs all over the country and in Ohio. And it has people absolutely furious, as they should be. These are the people they elect. They pay their salaries. They're signing an NDA with a company and not saying anything to the community. And if you live near one of these data centers, it feels like a betrayal, that they betrayed you in order to get something done with this, super wealthy company that's coming in. And it's unbelievable. So I think the NDAs are a huge problem. The utility costs are also a big issue, which is, why am I paying more and why are you doing this behind closed doors?
Carson, I want to pivot to another issue if I could, but one that's very much in the zeitgeist, and that has to do with prediction markets. And a few weeks back, we talked to Senator Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan and the efforts that she's made to kind of ban betting on political events. Yes, in her office, but in other parts of the government as well. I know that that's something you've been kind of pushing also. Is that something that's getting traction here? I look at this as kind of this nascent form of, I don't want to say investment. I think it is more so betting than that, but it is certainly something that
you ask,
a swirling conversation.
Had,
yes, a swirling conversation about regulation. Where are we in that conversation in Washington, D.C. about how to treat sites that allow you to do this?
I mean, at the moment, the majority has not put forward a bill. Senator Slotkin has a bill. I've got a bill. There's a ton of bills. This is part of, our anti-corruption bill called Drain the Swamp, which is I would argue, the most comprehensive anti-corruption bill introduced so far, and it includes the ban on prediction markets. But this is a big issue where people are looking at politicians right now and seeing them make tons of money and wondering why they're struggling, and they want their government cleaned up. The prediction markets, it's just awful because you can bet on anything. And, if you're a public employee, whether you're elected or you're just on salary, but you're in the know, you should not touch these predictive markets for any reason, under any circumstance. And so mine is a full ban on participation by anyone who gets a public salary.
Anecdotally, have you seen other lawmakers, other officials, even people in your, you have a window into places that sometimes we don't get to see, these previous information. Have you seen these people either talking about or flirting with the idea of placing bets on some of these things?
I've not heard anyone talk about placing a bet, but they talk about it all the time. Everyone's bringing up these predictive markets, and they'll say, well, Kaushi has this issue at this, or that, race at the, at this level, whatever it is. It is something that everyone is talking about. I've never been on any of these platforms, so I don't know exactly all of the things that are being, put in the mix to have people trade on, but it seems like it's almost everything. And it's just the room for corruption is huge. And the appearance of wrongdoing is obviously very, very serious too. Both of those things have to be dealt with. And the only way to deal with it is just to ban anyone with a public salary from participating in any of the markets.
Before we let you go, I'm going to return to what I said a moment ago, that your district is home to so many companies that do a lot of transacting across the country, big distribution center. And the news of the weekend, of course, is the dissolution of these talks between the U.S. and Canada. Canada now being tariffed, its exports being tariffed at 50%, seeing the retaliatory tariffs come into play here in the weeks ahead. What does that mean for folks in your district? So some geographic remove from the Canada border, but I imagine very reliant on that longstanding trade relationship with Canada.
Yeah, so far it's been terrible. When I'm home, which is, most of the time, we spend, a chunk of the time in D.C. and a chunk of the time back home. Most of us travel around our districts and we do tours and meet with businesses and tour their facilities, their plants, whatever it is. And everywhere I've gone for the last 2 years, I say, can you tell me about the tariffs? Is it hurting? Is it helping? I try not to be, show my hand in terms of my own frustration with these tariffs. And not a single company, I've yet to meet a single company that says anything other than they have cost us a lot of money. And this is just going to cost them more. And they're paying so much for this administration to fight these trade wars. And no one understands the strategy. No one.
All right, Congressman, we're going to have to leave it there. Representative Greg Landsman from Ohio, thank you so much for joining us.
Appreciate your time on this Sunday. We also talked to Republican Congressman from Georgia, Rich McCormick, and we started with the federal debt crossing that $40 trillion threshold.
I'm kind of glad we hit the landmark. It brings attention back to one of the biggest challenges in government. I always said the education, healthcare, and debt are the three biggest challenges to America. This is a landmark for sure. The problem is every time we get further in debt, we've been downgraded twice as a currency. When we reach the corruption of Social Security, which is going to come this next presidency, you'll see a real uptick in the ability to borrow versus the interest rate, and that's going to basically hamstring us. I don't even know if we'll be the industry standard at that point of currency. I've told it several times. We had several of us, about 20 of us, holding out on different bills. But the president a lot of times says, look, this is the best bill you can get. And this is why I don't think we need a filibuster for a budget. Now, I agree. I think we should have a filibuster for everything else, every other law. But for the budget, it's our only constitutional responsibility. It doesn't matter if the Republicans or the Democrats are in charge. Whenever you have a filibuster, it just adds pork. That's one thing we could do that would be really easy to reduce the deficit spending.
But you said, the president says, well, this is just the best bill that you can get. Do you think he's worried enough about the national debt?
I don't think anybody's worried enough when it comes to politics. I'm very concerned that when we actually talk about what our future is for Americans, for our children, when they're paying $2 trillion in debt servicing, which is coming quickly, by the way, in the next 10 years, I would say, we've already doubled our debt just in the last decade. Think about that. We went from about 20 trillion to 40 trillion in just 10 years. Our interest rates are going up because we've been degraded as a currency. This is a massive problem. It's going to affect everything we fund. When you only bring in about a little over $5 trillion in taxation and revenue, and then you spend $7 trillion every year, and it's going up, and the disparities are becoming greater, that's not a good sign for the future.
We talk a lot about AI on the show, and I imagine it's something you're talking about when you're on the campaign trail as well, when you're back in your home district in and around Alpharetta. It's become a real political issue, the building of these data centers. And I wonder sort of where you fall on if the U.S. should be going full steam ahead building these things, if you'd counsel there needed to be more time here for communities to consider the impact that they might have on them. What's your outlook on the massive data center build that we're seeing across this country?
Well, I've toured several data centers. I just got back from NVIDIA a couple of weeks ago, talked to Jensen Huang, talked to leaders in the industry, I've talked to community leaders, people who are concerned. One of the things that really worries me is actually outside influence. We have some communities that have 250 people show up to protest a data center being built in that community when you know there's hardly more than that in the community. We have people being shipped here from all over the United States. What is a concerted effort? Why are people from other communities coming in? I think this is a bit nefarious. I think that China or somebody who doesn't want us to compete with them is funding it because this is something we do need as Americans. If you think about the wealth, the technology, the ability to solve things in the healthcare, let's say cancer, radiology, energy, pretty much will affect every portion of our life. And if we don't get this right, we will fall behind. There are ways to do it very responsibly, by the way. It doesn't, all the data centers now are closed loop. They don't consume water, they recirculate it. The energy sources, those fuel cells that we're producing are phenomenally clean and produce enough energy to fund them and then some. In other words, it could be a benefit to the community. So all the worries, all the drummed up alarmism is really bad for the future of America if we don't get this right. I was just over in Ireland and talking to through the ambassador there to the companies there. And if they don't build data centers and energy sources, they will move those 70% of their income is produced by American headquarters in Ireland. They will move somewhere else. That's not a good sign for the future of business and wealth in America. And by the way, we can build it on basis. That was my suggestion to the president and to the administration. Basically, you're not going to have any protests. You can see you have plenty of land. Fort Gordon is the cybersecurity headquarters. It's a great place to build. Fort Benning, Fort Hunter, all these places just in Georgia alone. Every state just about has a massive base where you have room to build these. It wouldn't be a negative impact. Matter of fact, it'd be a very positive impact. And you can actually lease those and actually be additive to reduce the footprint of a base when it comes to expenditures.
I mean, I'm wondering if that's something the Pentagon or the president are pursuing some form of grammar. Sorry, it's been a long week. But I also want to follow up with, you said, there may be some nefarious nature to some of these protests. Do you have any evidence of that? We do have polling from Gallup that shows 7 in 10 Americans opposed data center construction in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, and I get that. But if it's in your neighborhood, I totally understand. If you're there from your neighborhood, it makes sense. But what about people when they're coming from all over the United States? That seems a little bit suspicious. The articles are written, and believe me, I've been in politics long enough to know that there are a lot of conspiracy theories out there. I think there's a lot of misinformation on data centers. I get it's a hot topic, but it's up to us to educate the public on what it is and is not. People even criticize, it's just a temporary job. Every construction job is a temporary job until that construction is done, then you move on to the next. It's very good for the local economy. It's not going to be obnoxious or loud. It's not going to produce a heat signature that's going to go outside of that area. It's not going to consume water. It's not going to detract from your energy bills. So what is the real information that we need in order to make a good decision? Because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, and that's what we need to be good at, is being proactive, being visionary rather than reactive and reacting to the mobs that maybe don't have all the details.
Wanted to add, you sit on the Armed Services Committee, and there was this announcement that the U.S. is going to withdraw from these military exercises it's done with South Korea. And I'm curious what you make of that. You, having been in the Marines and the Navy, is this a step in the right direction, do you think? Or are you somebody who believes that those exercises are critical for kind of showing American might in the Pacific?
I hope it's temporary. I actually participated in those exercises. I was stationed over in Korea a few times, actually deployed on basically their version of an expeditionary unit on a ship, doing amphibious assault landings. It was a delightful experience. The Koreans, the Rock Marines over there, oh man, are they bad. I love those guys, really hardcore. Love training with those guys. They see the world similarly. They have one enemy, one fight. Their motto is Pilson, which means they must win. If they lose, they're dead. They understand the fight. They see the world similar to us. They have a similar faith. They have a similar economy structure. I want to see them go closer to us, not to other countries who are basically invested in communism. That's really good for the stabilization of that area. But I'm one of those people that believes in integration of foreign areas that are very friendly to us. I think that's very good for our force projection and peace through strength.
We see the USS Abraham Lincoln making its way back to the United States after an incredibly
Speaking of resource issues.
Yeah, incredibly long deployment. What is your takeaway from that? Yes, we've all seen the stories of what conditions were like on that carrier. Is there a broader takeaway that you have about resources, as Christina mentions, the way that they're being deployed right now?
Yeah, so you're talking to the right guy. I've been on 3 Marine expeditionary units. I've lived about 2 years on a ship. The first one I was on was USS Tripoli. It was retired right after our float, so it was a really old ship. Went dead in the water 4 times in the Persian Gulf, and the top of the deck was about 140 degrees. I mean, just sitting in your room, no air conditioning, just sweating profusely. It was gross. We had raw sewage coming out of Thailand all over the ship. Things happen. I mean, that's the realities of this that's been going on for decades, by the way. That was back in the mid-90s, not to date myself. But this is what we do. I mean, sometimes there's hardships that happen. We are a creature of necessity. We deploy as needed. And most crew members understand that. By the way, even back then, we had crew members try to jump off the ship to commit suicide or to make a statement. So this is nothing new. This is just an ongoing issue. I understand that we don't want to keep people out for longer than 6 months if possible, but sometimes necessity dictates.
All right, Congressman Rich McCormick from Georgia. Now, we are just a few days away from the start of the Jackson Hole Economic Policy Symposium, which I'm told is without a doubt the most important monetary policy conference in the world.
Yes, the official theme of this year's gathering is...
What is the theme?
Drumroll, please.
Okay.
Financial innovation, implications for payments and policy.
Yeah, put that on a cake.
But what everyone is waiting for is the speech Fed Chair Kevin Warsh is scheduled to deliver on Friday at 10 o'clock Wall Street time. That is 8 o'clock Grand Tetons time. Tom Keene will be there, and he is back with us before he makes the pilgrimage to the Cowboy State. We're also joined this morning by Henrietta Treyz, who's the Director of Economic Policy at Veda Partners. Tom, let me start with you. You've been to this many years running now.
Way too many.
I don't want to say how many. How highly anticipated is this speech? I think it's a trope. We lean on it. Oh, the Fed chair is going to speak. The world will be listening. In this circumstance, is it different?
I would say in 25 years, there's been 3 or 4 times like this. Without question, I'll say the summer of 07, right after the 4 standard deviation move in LIBOR, that was huge. I have a clear memory of Stanley Fischer glued to the phone, looking out at the Rocky Mountains, and there was some
trying to get service.
Real tension, real angst. It's a different tension this time, but it's a big deal.
Henrietta, what do investors, what do attendants want to hear? What makes this a success, especially given everything that's happened in the past week?
You know, the piece that I'm really interested in is obviously the combination of Warsh and how he is thinking about all the stuff that the Treasury Department is simultaneously doing. We basically are also getting, at the same time, 2 secret plans from Treasury Secretary Bessent to fight the war with Iran and also to fight the war that they have with the bond market. So it's a fascinating dynamic to see the interplay between Treasury and the secretary there and Warsh at the Fed.
And
so I think those two combined are amazing.
And Henrietta nails it in that we got to get to Friday.
Yeah.
This idea that we're going to saunter out there and have a wonderful time. I mean, Tracy Alloway and Joe Weisenthal.
They'll have a wonderful time.
But the rest of us, it's this unknown of market data Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and even opening Friday.
Henrietta, let me pick up on what you were saying there. So at the last press conference, the Fed chair said, when asked about this speech, he's looking at a blank piece of paper and picking up on what Tom said a moment ago. It sounds like it would be folly for him to start writing this now. Let's hope he hadn't drafted it before what happened last week.
That's true. That's a good point.
Difficult. How does he approach what's happened here over the last week? We were talking in the last hour with Tom and Tony Crescenzi just about the kind of historical roles of the Fed and the Treasury. This upends all of that, and I wonder sort of how you think he's approaching the speech that he's going to give on Friday.
I mean, I don't envy him. I feel a lot like when I try to prepare to go on Tom Keene's show on Monday mornings. You have to be ready 15 minutes before to see what has just happened. I think with regards to this specific week, the scale of what we're talking about is so expansive. So, for example, if the Treasury Secretary rolls out a plan that imposes massive sanctions on China, what is the reaction function? Are we now dealing with a situation where we're going to tariff China again? Are they going to retaliate by limiting critical minerals and rare earths coming back to the United States? That is a huge impact on our inflation numbers, which, of course, is the remit of the Fed. So there's, as you point out, no way his paper has any writing on it going into tomorrow, let alone Friday.
Tom, in the pantheon of economic symposium boondoggles, why is this one so important?
They're important. Francine Lacroix would tell you that Sintra in Portugal is just as well. Frankly, I think Sintra's more modern, more with it. The Kansas City Fed keeps a tight rope on the procedure here. There are a set of papers. Mike McKee is in the inner room past the 8-foot grizzly bear, and McKee is in the room with the other elite. And they're going through boring, sometimes brilliant academic papers. Sometimes there's a lot of yelling and screaming. And then there's a choreography where the global central bankers walk out and they do the beauty walk out to the split rail fence, and the American central banker goes, Wyoming. And, you know, they do that. There's a whole ballet.
Is this like a photo op? This is like the G20 photo op?
You'll be right there for that.
I think it was Powell. One time the speech was 9 minutes, 46 seconds. Right. John Farrow had a donut in his mouth. It was such a short speech. And, you know, you really never know all of this parade wrapped around the speech. I would suggest boring speech with maybe one single sentence, or he really steps up and writes what was perceived as a disastrous press conference.
How have you thought since that first press conference about Chair Warsh's approach to this job, particularly on the communications front? We can talk about the task forces and all of that, but he was very adamant in the way in which he wants to conduct himself, how the Fed should be conducting itself when it comes to communication. I imagine before this intervention, maybe that's what he would have dwelled on a little bit.
He's getting what he wants, frankly. He's getting much more of a, like, here's the markets, this is a stew, and then we'll act after the fact. So I think he's like halfway there. He's, like everyone else, including us, has been overcome by events. I mean, Henrietta knows it. I pulled an all-nighter, Christina, just trying to keep up with Carney and Trump on Canada. I mean, it's all moving in real time. It's the same for the chairman.
Henrietta, can we pull back from this a little bit? Because if you're not one of these cool people, you guys, who knows the ins and outs of these things and why they matter, if you're average American going to the polls in November, you may not be able to track the precise ins and outs of what's happening with the bond buybacks, with what Warsh is doing at the Fed, but you know what's happening at the pump. You know what's happening to your paycheck, and you see that there's this rattling around. You know something is going on. How does this filter down to average Americans? Do they care? Should they care?
It's a fascinating question, Christina. You know, there is actually historical polling trends that show us it's not necessarily the price of gasoline that is a huge problem for the American voter. I mean, we're at what, like $4.10 right now? That's obviously a steep curve. That's very expensive. So we're going to pick up on that. And the number one issue for voters right now is inflation by a country mile. But it's really actually the chaos that voters respond to. And you can see that backlash building right now. The president's approval rating is as low as 33% in the latest Reuters poll. The Republican conference is losing special elections nationwide from Tennessee to Virginia by double digits. And it's really this fluctuation in, oh my gosh, why are we intervening in the bond market? Why are we intervening in the yen? Why are we intervening in Iran? Why is the Strait still closed? It's the chaos of it all that is driving voters away from the Republican conference, and specifically the independent voter. The independent voter is defaulting towards Democrats. And not to bring too much into the table in this conversation, but you're seeing them at a pivotal time decide that Republicans are not presenting an opportunity for legislation or a policy that they support. And so that's having a ripple down effect to even how they feel about AI. How do you feel about data centers? And Democrats are winning that conversation because of, I would argue, a lot of the last 18 months of the Trump administration and what they've seen from the Republican conference. It's a really interesting moment in time to be asking voters to weigh in.
Tom, pick up on this, because so much of the agita in the bond market centers on the fact that we did surpass this $40 trillion threshold in U.S. debt.
Right.
debt to GDP ratio not looking great. And to Henrietta's point, in a moment like that, customarily, you're not looking at the Treasury Department, you're looking up to Capitol Hill, you're looking for some sort of action here. And you know well how long this conversation has gone on over. There's hand-wringing about the U.S. fiscal house and very little gets done.
It's in the very New Testament, the gospel according to Henrietta. Nobody votes on fiscal policy. We know that going back and back and back. Is this time different? And I'm hearing some conversations saying, you know what, 40 trillion's a round number, and this time may be different. I would focus much more on the gift of the stimulus-driven, AI-driven boom economy, which has said, okay, the deficit's where it is, the interest expense is where it is, but boy, it's a boom economy, great. And to me, the absolute hallmark here into the election is, does nominal GDP pull back? To me, that's the number one thing I'm watching.
And Henrietta, speaking of the Hill, we've got some breaking news from the New York Times reporting that the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has met with Democratic leader Representative Hakeem Jeffries to talk about ways they could possibly find common ground. That sounds like Republicans are planning to lose in November, but I'm wondering how you take that reporting if it is indeed factual.
Yeah, I bet they are meeting. There is a lot of risk specifically for the Trump administration. When I meet with Democratic leadership, one of the core obvious approaches that they're going to have, and my forecast is 90% odds that the Democrats take the House, but I still feel like Republicans have a better hand in the United States Senate. So you're not going to be in a position to pass legislation. They will have to address the debt ceiling, avoid a government shutdown. Those really sort of basic things that can nonetheless be economically catastrophic. But really, it's the investigation and oversight. And right now, the Democratic strategy is to go after not just Trump officials. You can do Pete Hegseth or RFK Jr., Kristi Noem, or whomever. But there's also a tremendous amount of focus on the idea that there is a relationship between the Trump administration and private enterprise, whether that's Apple, Google, Microsoft, NVIDIA. Why are you getting a special license to sell your chips to China? What's that about? Are you returning the tariff revenue to consumers, Walmart or Apple? Have you gotten a refund? And what are you doing with prices? So there's going to be this affordability lens. There's going to be a corruption lens. Why are these companies donating millions of dollars to a ballroom? What's going on there? There's a lot for the administration to be concerned about, and Kushner should be with Hakeem Jeffries right now.
Henrietta, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Henrietta Treyz joining us from Veda Partners. Tom Keene with us as well. And you can catch Tom alongside Lisa Abramowitz on Bloomberg's special coverage of the Jackson Hole Economic Symposium on Friday. I should say Michael McKee making his way out there, buying the tickets to the Jackson Hole Rodeo. He'll be contributing in that coverage as well. Let's get you up to speed now on today's top stories. Here's Alexis Christoforous.
All right, thanks very much, guys. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney says he had little choice but to impose retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. after the Trump administration slapped a 50% surcharge yesterday on $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, everything from wine to hockey sticks. Carney says Canada will retaliate dollar for dollar beginning September 8th, targeting sectors including steel, dairy, appliances, and agricultural equipment. Trade talks between the longtime allies broke down Friday night, and both the U.S. and Canada now face the risk of a full-scale trade war. And now to a Bloomberg exclusive. Some of NVIDIA's biggest customers have been told that the prices of servers containing its artificial intelligence chips are going up by more than 15% in many cases because of the soaring cost of memory chips. The price hikes will go into effect on systems shipped early next year and will impact systems including those with the flagship Vera Rubin and Grace Blackwell chips. Major technology companies, including Apple and Qualcomm, have recently said they've been forced to charge more for their products because of chip shortages. And now it's the moon's turn to pull a disappearing act. North and South America will get a front row seat to a near total lunar eclipse coming Thursday into Friday. That's when the Earth's shadow will briefly envelop 96% of the moon, making this an especially deep partial eclipse. You are watching Bloomberg This Weekend. We'll be right back. Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Alexis Christoforous. Let's update you on today's top stories. President Trump is set to wave the green flag at today's historic Freedom 250 Indy car race in Washington, D.C. Trump and First Lady Melania will lead a pre-race lap in the presidential limousine before watching the open-wheel race zoom past iconic national monuments along Pennsylvania Avenue at speeds approaching 200 miles per hour. Hold on to your hats. There will also be a pre-race show and a flyover of military aircraft. The Indy car race is the latest of President Trump's celebrations to mark America's 250th birthday. Chinese humanoid robots broke records set by humans yesterday, including beating Usain Bolt's 100-meter sprint world record on opening day of the World Humanoid Robot Games in Beijing. That is a thing. They are 5 days of games. They demonstrate China's progress in advanced robotics and feature more than 2,000 humanoid robots competing in over 50 events, including running, table tennis, and soccer. And it may just be the final round for Live Golf this weekend. The Upstart Golf League is hosting a tournament outside Indianapolis as it scrambles to find new investors after Saudi Arabia pulled its funding in April. When it came on the scene in 2022, Live lured away some golf stars, including Bryson DeChambeau, with promises of big payments. In recent months, though, Live has called off tournaments, it's slashed prize money and delayed player payouts. DeChambeau says he hopes the league is given, quote, one more shot as it fights to secure the funding and player support it needs to survive. You know, a couple of the players have already moved over back to the PGA Tour. They had to give up some money and equity to do it, but that was the path back for them.
Back to it. All right. Yeah. Alexis, thank you very much. Appreciate it. We're going to go here from golf to tennis.
I'm so sad Lisa isn't here. She loves pronouncing all these names. All right. It is time once again for the U.S. Open in New York as Fan Week kicks off this week. Oh, it's starting today. Now, the actual tennis is going to start on Sunday, August 13th.
Well, last year's winner, Carlos Alcaraz, looks to defend his titles, teaming up with American tennis legend Serena Williams to play mixed doubles. Alcaraz will not get the chance to face his biggest rival, Jannik Sinner, who pulled out of the tournament with a knee injury.
That's right. But this year, technology is also taking center court as more athletes turn to data and AI to improve their play. We spoke to IBM Senior Vice President Jonathan Adashek and retired American tennis pro Sam Querrey on how IBM's new app is changing the game and coaching in its Game Set Match.
We are so excited. I mean, this is our 35th year with the U.S. Open, and they've been such a great partner at working differently and trying new technologies. And this year, we've got a lot of amazing new features. First is the live updates. So think of it as your homepage. When you log on to the app, you get what you want right away. You don't have to go navigate through. So it really gives you a much more engaging, quick, responsive experience. Then we've got serve quality. Serve quality, usually you've looked at serves and you just...
Is this an objective measure?
It is data-driven.
Okay.
It is data-driven. Yeah. And, you know, Sam was a big server,
We're going to get his take on this in a minute.
And serve quality looks at 21 different points of the body, looking at the limb movement, looking at racket movements, putting that together and getting a serve quality score so that you can really understand, was that person hot, were they cold, what was going on, more than just how many miles per hour that serve went. Then we've got the match chat feature, which is building on last year, where you could ask a question about what was going on. This allows more natural language processing, but it's also bringing in photos and videos into the answers, which is really a next level of engagement on this. And finally, it's about key moments. Key moments is really looking beyond just the obvious, oh, they won this set. It's looking at how long was a rally? Did a player get an ace to win a set? What are these moments, those more subtle moments, to give a better storyline to pull through so people can understand more of how the tide is changing in the match?
I feel like this would be helpful for me. I do actually watch tennis, but all the other sports balls that my co-anchors watch that I do not, when we have to recap the game, I could just read it off the AI and then be like, what were the key moments? And then I could pretend that I had watched the game, but I would never do that to you. Sam, when you played, I mean, it hasn't been that long, but I feel like the data has gotten so much more aggressive for all athletes in the last couple years. Like, when you're serving, do you want me knowing exactly how good each one of your serves is, or would you rather people just kind of went off vibes?
Well, if I'm serving, the opponent, I don't have a choice in what they know. So I think a lot of times it comes down to the coach now. The coach will actually now use the IBM app. They'll go on the app, look at all the data points, and then maybe give their player 2 or 3 obvious points. Because as a player, I can't think about 15 to 20 different things if I'm returning or serving.
Right.
That's where the coach comes in. If there's data that they can look at that's obvious, they can then give that to the player, and the player can kind of go with those 3 or 4 bullet points.
But do you think anything gets lost? I mean, I know that the line calls now are kind of automated. I personally kind of miss people fighting over some of these line calls. Do they still?
They still put it up for a close call.
Right. It seems a lot less cantankerous than it used to be. But like Sam is do you lose any of the the naturalness of the game if you're getting too data-driven with some of this stuff?
No, I don't think. Look, the winner of the U.S. Open this year, they just put out yesterday, gets $5.5 million. You can't miss a line call by a few inches when there's that much money on the line. And going back to my previous point, yes, the data is nuts right now, right? You can have 1,000 different data points, and the players aren't going to look at all of it. But again, that's where it kind of comes down to the coach and the team. They can look at all of it and then decipher what they feel is important for a particular match or matchup, for their particular player. But it's so nice for the coaches, especially, to have all this data, and they can really pull back the layers and kind of see, all right, going back to those key moments, what are the key moments of the matches? If you win a rally over 12 shots, is that going to help you? If you save a certain number of break points serving at this location, is that going to help you? So you're able to just get so much deeper in the information now, and that's so helpful once it trickles its way to the players.
I'm going to describe this for our listeners and for those who may have missed it, but as Sam was talking, Jonathan, you had a very self-satisfied acknowledgement there of him saying that coaches are using the IBM platform here to kind of give tips to their players. I mean, that's pretty wild. I think if, there's
the kind
crazy.
I thought it was mostly
like
a user experience.
Consumer-facing part of this, but it is pretty wild to think that this is kind of determining the way that people are coached in the middle of the tournament. I didn't mean that in a pejorative way, but
it's okay. We are fortunate that we've got a great partner like the USTA, like the Open, that allows us to put this data together and give it to people. And I think to build on what Sam's talking about, where it also comes in handy is that night after. As they start thinking about who are they playing next. If you win, who are you playing next? Can you go back in and look at how somebody played before? How did they do in that match? What were those key moments? How was their serve quality? So you can start thinking about that and get it in a much more concise fashion. Because as Sam said, the players have a tight focus of time. But if you think about the fans who are also watching, they're really focused, and they've got a bunch of different competing things that once that match is over, they're off to looking at something else. And they might step away in the middle of a match. How do you bring them back up to date very quickly with things like match chat and with likelihood to win, which I didn't talk about before, which we've had historically, but now this year, with every point, the likelihood to win will change. So it's much more dynamic versus just saying at the beginning of a match, so-and-so is going to have 82%.
Based on ranking or whatever.
Yep. It's kind of a question for both of you, but Sam, I'll start with you. What is the best part about being at the U.S. Open, playing at the U.S. Open? Like, what makes it kind of a singular event?
It's those nighttime matches. U.S. Open's known for the night matches, especially sometimes when they trickle into the next day, I guess you would say. It goes into 12:30, 1 a.m., people are 5, 6, 7 honey deuces deep, and it has an atmosphere and an electricity that is like no other tournament around the world. When you get to play as a player in Arthur Ashe Stadium at night, it feels like you're at a college football event in the South. It is just bigger than life. And so I think if you were to ask the players, where is the best tennis atmosphere in the world? It's in New York, it's at the U.S. Open, but particularly the night session there on Arthur Ashe Stadium.
Jonathan, we got about 90 seconds left.
I love the excitement and the energy of the Open. I've been fortunate. I've gone to many of the Grand Slams, but that energy of the Open is really unlike anything else I think you see in a lot of different sports. And people just get into it. And as Sam talked about, there are plenty of these matches deeper into the tournament that go deep into the night, early morning hours. And the crowd still is there, and they are engaging, and they love it. And the ability for us to bring that to people, whether you're sitting there or you're watching from home or you were there and then you left because you got to get up for work the next morning, the app is a new way. We take this information to 14 million people around the world every year.
Jonathan Adashek there of IBM, Sam Querrey, former professional tennis player. Great conversation. The Burger King Whopper are getting a new look, says the Wall Street Journal. More on that next. You can take us with you no matter where you go on Bloomberg Television, radio, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is time for BT Dubs. I know someone rewrote that copy.
Yeah.
I'm not saying BTW. It is BT Dubs. I'm Christina Ruffini.
Do my best week in and week out.
Here with David Gura. And Alexis is going to run us through some stories we might have missed this week. Alexis, what you got?
All right, I'm going to stay out of that whole thing.
Stay out of that fight. It's a fracas you don't want a part of. Yeah.
So messing with my copy. All right.
It seems cat lady Taylor Swift is actually dog mom Taylor Swift.
Interesting.
So when
it's a new
Swift's,
era.
it
I
is.
will try so hard
oh,
to
I like
care
how you
about this,
did
but
that.
continue.
There we go.
Okay, so when Swift's
that went over my
husband,
head.
Travis
I got it.
Kelce, walked off their private plane recently with a Samoyed dog, Swifties took note.
Yep.
Searches for Samoyeds on the American Kennel Club website jumped 15% the week Swift and Kelce's Sammy made its runway debut. It's right now the 55th most popular dog breed in America. But
For
you
now.
know what? Yeah, Swift and Kelce, I'm sure they can change that. So if you can see this, we're showing pictures of these beautiful, big, white, fluffy
All
dogs.
I'm thinking about, to interrupt,
Yeah.
lint rollers. How many lint rollers do you need in the house?
It's a
to have to
lot.
deal
I've
with
known
that
people who
fur?
had Samoyeds, and it was.
We had one when I was a kid,
did?
and I used to. Mine was so beautiful, and I was 3 years old. There are pictures of me riding riding it like a horse.
Like a horse.
Yeah, we were best friends. Here's some trivia for you. The Samoyeds come from Siberia. They can cost as much as $7,000, and they need to be groomed every 6 to 8 weeks.
Wow.
Absolutely not.
Take that, Brutus.
Brutus has also ridden on top of one of these dogs.
Oh, I was going to say, hopefully you did not ride
Really?
Brutus.
No, our neighbor has one, and
Brutus,
she thought
yeah.
it would be fun, so we plopped my little 5-pound dog on top of a very
I think
giant,
that's
fluffy
so
cloud, and
cute.
it was pretty
Yes.
adorable.
Lady Gaga, though, back in 2014 when she had the French Bulldog, we
yes.
saw a big resurgence in French
All right.
Bulldog ownership.
Breeders
All right.
take
We
note.
talked about dachshunds this week. Maybe Samoyeds will be next.
All right, moving on to a Bloomberg story I found this week. And you can file this one under nice if you can afford it.
Okay.
Parents spending nearly $100,000 on gap years to give their kids an edge in the workplace. So there is something called the Gap Year Association. It says its membership has doubled in the past 6 years to include 90 programs. I'll give you an idea of what they do there. An 8-month trip around the world bungee jumping near the Victoria Falls in southern Africa. How about visiting a Brazilian bank, learning how to code an app overseas?
You know, I remember, so Nick Kristof, the columnist at the Times, always promoted this, but not in this way. It was
Yeah.
to go do AmeriCorps, go on some adventure of your own design. I can get behind that. I think between, like thinking about where I was as a senior in high school, I could have used a year to center myself, but I don't know about paying
$100,000. In many cases, more than a year of college. And some of these parents are saying their kids are getting an experience here they wouldn't get at college.
Sure.
And they're saying
Trip
they're giving
around
them
the
an edge in the workplace. I don't know if it gives you an edge in the workplace, but it's certainly a wonderful life experience.
Just so you can be the insufferable guy who was like, well, you know, when I was in Thailand, blah, blah, blah.
Probably get like a sweet hat from these places you get to wear.
I hope at least that for that amount of money.
All right, what else you got?
Washington Post. Okay, most Americans have lived unmarried with a partner by the time they're in their early 30s, or actually early 40s. Excuse me.
Early 40s.
So living together before marriage used to be taboo, right?
Wow.
Well, now it is the dominant way Americans are forming partnerships. It is called cohabitating, by the way. That's the proper phrasing here. And according to the Pew Research Center, 77% of adults have lived with 2 or more partners they're not married to by their early 40s. About 2/3 of couples who live together.
Not at the same time.
No, not at the same time.
A string
Well,
of
that's called
cohabitations.
Three's Company, right?
Oh.
Okay. All right. About 2/3 of couples who live together do eventually get married. And then that figure jumps to 77% if they each have a bachelor's degree. So I guess they looked at education here.
What if they've taken a gap year?
That throws the whole thing off. The typical cohabitating relationship lasts 18 months before ending in either marriage or a breakup.
Okay.
All right.
And
You know,
older
I
adults
understand
are
that. You want to
cohabitating
see
more.
how it's going to go? Test drive the relationship in the crucible of a home or apartment?
Yeah, just don't tell her it's a test drive. Don't
No, you
tell
shouldn't,
her
of course.
that.
You
Don't
wanna
use that
say that.
terminology,
But this is
please.
where we are.
Okay. Wall Street Journal. I don't know if you guys do the Burger King Whopper thing or McDonald's.
It's been a long time since I've had a Whopper, but I know they've gone through some reinvention and famously have fired the king.
Yes, I know. It's gone through a lot of revamping, but apparently it's paying off because its signature Whopper with a premium bun, new mayo, and a box to preserve freshness is now overtaking the McDonald's and Wendy's when it comes to sales growth.
Wow.
So Burger King has reclaimed the #2 spot among U.S. burger chains in terms of sales. And it's been doing a whole bunch of things. It's helping, it's ordering kiosks, digital menu boards, it's expanding its marketing, a whole bunch of different things.
But we're talking about relativism here. They were at a low point. They were a bit of a nadir. They're kind of climbed the
McDonald's is
rate
still-
of adoption.
Yes, the
burger
famous,
adoption.
well-known Whopper nadir, as David
Yes.
Gura has put it. Okay, I would
Trademark
like
that,
to point out
Burger King.
things I was not expecting from you. Knowledge about Burger King's advertising and having fired the king, and also knowledge of Meghan Markle's jams today. But, I'm sorry.
I try to keep abreast of all of the latest in popular culture. I'm not a Burger King fan. I'm going to say that. I don't mean to be
They
advertorial
are flame
about it.
char.
So
they're
they've always
charbroiled.
said. But on the occasional times I stop at a roadside fast food restaurant, Rarely Burger King.
No, I don't think I've eaten one in 20 years.
20 years.
Wow. Maybe they need a jingle. They need a jingle like the Whopper.
No?
Their chicken options aren't great.
Their chicken options. Oh, you're a chicken eater.
I'm a
that's
chicken
right.
person.
Wait, I'm going to do it. This is the jingle. 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun.
You got it. That's the Big Mac.
Remember that?
That's the Big Mac. You
That's
got
the Big Mac.
it.
That's the Big
So
Mac. That's what I'm saying. The Whopper needs that. Okay, they're going to work on it.
All right. Burger King, reach out. Alexis Christoforous.
I'm on
Jingle it up,
She's
you two.
available. Jingleheimer Schmidt. All right. Thank you very much for that. BTW, as we call it, the segment here each
You know what?
weekend.
It's the end of Sunday. You can call it whatever you want right now. Alexis, thanks for hanging out with us this
Yes.
weekend. We
My
really
pleasure.
appreciate it. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us on Bloomberg this weekend. You can join our colleagues in Asia this evening when the global stock markets kick off trading at 7 p.m. Eastern. And tune in tomorrow for a conversation with many of the excellent guests we always have on our programming.
Yes.
I'm Christina Ruffini.
Jackson Hole looming large here. I'm David Gura, alongside alongside Alexis Christoforous. God, it's just a mess.
Lisa's
Can you
back
tell?
next
It's been a busy weekend. We'll be back with you Saturday,
We've had a
7 a.m.
day,
Eastern
but we've
Time. The
survived.
Show Show starts right now on Bloomberg Radio and television.